¿No me bajaría el volumen de la radio? Sí, gracias.
Check 1, 2.
Good morning, everyone. This is the Higher Education and Employment Advancement Committee. It is a forum that we're having today on October 2nd to learn more about the United States Supreme Court decision that came out earlier this year dealing with race-conscious admissions policies and how that decision will have an impact, what kind of impact it will have on college campuses in the state of Connecticut. My name is Derek Slapp, State Senator from the 5th State Senate District. I'm joined by my colleague, Representative Haddad, who will share some comments in just a minute. I just wanted to thank the panelists ahead of time and all the members. I know everybody has a busy schedule. We have a few with us in person, and we have others we believe will be attending virtually, kind of in and out throughout the next few hours. And I want to thank, again, the panelists who have made time for this very important topic, something that we're all, I think, wherever people land on the decision, I think one thing is clear is that higher education plays a critical role in the state of Connecticut, in our workforce development, into helping, move people socioeconomically, and we need to ensure its strength. I believe that diversity is a key strength for higher education, and so very important that we talk about this and fully understand its impact. Just one thing I want to address, which is timing. Some might say, well, why are we doing this now as opposed to waiting until our regular session, which occurs in February? And my response to that is really two reasons. One is that we have a short legislative session, right? We start in February and we end in May. So it's really a sprint. And the other thing is that when we have public hearings during the session, they're typically in response to, even if they're kind of subject matter, they're in response to specific proposals. And so what we wanted to do was kind of back up the process and really start with an opportunity for all of us, but also people in the state of Connecticut who have questions to really learn, right? And to ask questions to help us determine if in fact we do need a legislative response to this, or maybe we don't. And we might have differences of opinion, but that's kind of the role that I see this playing, and why I think it was important. We decided, the summer, it's hard to get people, but as soon as the summer ended, we wanted to have a chance to have this forum. So again, thanks to everybody. And we'll make sure everybody has a chance, to weigh in. But let me just see if my colleague and co-chair has any opening comments. Representative.
Thank you, Senator Slapp. I agree with the assessment that Senator Slapp just made. The Supreme Court decision, I don't think was much of a surprise by the time it came out. We'll learn, I think, from our initial panel that this was a court case that was sort of winding its way through the system for a long time. And when it was finally revealed, it was not it wasn't surprising in terms of that's what the outcome would be. But I think that we need to get a real grip on what the ramifications will be and what the outcomes will be in terms of opportunity for students here in Connecticut. A couple years ago, the New England Board of Higher Education did an analysis of post-secondary pathways or the post-secondary outcomes for different demographics. And so, in these are 2020 statistics, November 2020, really pre-pandemic. In 2020, 7.3 white high school graduates from Connecticut went on to high school for every 10, so 73%. But if you were a Black high school graduate in the state of Connecticut, that rate dropped to just 5.4, 54%. If you were Hispanic, that percentage dropped to just 49%. And so we see this opportunity gap that exists between, based solely on race, between white, Black, and Hispanic high school graduates. And I think that should be a concern to everyone, to see that the outcomes are so disparate based on what your race is in Connecticut. I think we're going to learn from our institutional panel that institutions have been making real progress in trying to mitigate that difference, that they've used race-conscious admissions to ensure that they are recruiting and enrolling a diverse set of students for their student body. And since those tools have now changed dramatically, I am concerned about what that we will be taking a small step backwards in terms of ensuring that opportunity is available to all students here in the state of Connecticut and in fact across the nation. So if that is the case, then I think that we need to develop new strategies that are within the parameters of what the Supreme Court allows, and to mitigate whatever negative impact and ramifications might come from the decision. And I look forward to learning more about what the decision says, how it came to be. And we'll be talking about that for the next 2 hours, and also talking about 3 hours, and also talking to institutions about what they anticipate they can do to ensure that their outcomes are what they want them to be without running afoul of the new rules as established by the Supreme Court. Would you like me to introduce our first panelist?
Let me just
Yeah.
see if our ranking members.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, let's do that.
Great. Before we go to our panelists, we want to just make sure that our members have an opportunity to make any comments before we start. Senator Kelly, Representative Haynes, if they, want to either now or later, they're welcome to. And I know Representative Cooley's here, Representative Turco as well. Any opening comments, Representative Cooley?
I just wanted to thank the chair, both chairs of the committee and the members of the committee, including the ranking members and our guests today for scheduling this now, because one of the important things is that those Connecticut residents that are in the process of applying for college this year, and this is the start of the college application season. The early applications are due relatively soon, have the information on how the playing field has shifted because of this decision. So I wanted to thank the chairman and the committee and our guests for bringing that information to the public, so the public is informed of the conditions, so that students applying for college this year are aware of what they need to do in reaction to the Supreme Court decision, because the game has changed a little bit. And I again, part of the purpose of this is information. And again, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Cooley. You hit it. It is crunch time right now for many high school seniors. So I know you as an educator know that well. Representative Haddad, you want to introduce our first panel?
Yes, thank you very much. So we have two very capable experts in the area, and I'll introduce first Peter McDonough. Peter is the Vice President and General Counsel for the American Council on Education. He joined ACE in January 2015. He's also the former General Counsel for Princeton University after joining that legal staff in 1990. Mr. McDonough has been active in the National Association of College and University Attorneys, serving as on its board of directors and chairing its committee on legal education, and serving as a member and co-chair of various other committees. And so I wanted to thank Mr. McDonough for his making himself available today and being ready to share his information and answer our questions. Additionally, we have Art Coleman. Art is the managing partner and co-founder of Education Council LLC. He has an extensive background providing legal policy, strategic planning, and advocacy services to educators throughout the country. Mr. Coleman, from 1993 to 2000, served as Senior Policy Advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. And then he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights for a number of years as well. He's a board member of the National Association of College and Universities Attorneys and National School Boards Association Council of School Attorneys. And when I was searching for panelists, both of your names came up. Virtually everybody I asked for who could sort of walk a group of non-lawyers who serve on this committee through the case and what the Supreme Court decision says and what the potential ramifications might be. And so we feel really grateful to have both of you here today to offer your expertise, and we appreciate your time. And I understand that you're going to start with a presentation, leaving some time at the end of your presentation for questions and answers by members of this committee. So thank you. Welcome to the committee, and we look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Slapp, Representative Haddad, colleagues up in Connecticut. I'm sitting down here in Washington, D.C. I suspect Art is sitting in D.C. himself. Just a tiny little bit more information about where I'm sitting and what that perspective is, because I think it might be a little bit helpful as y'all are thinking about these issues. And by the way, I really need to start with a thank you to you all. I think you're spot on to spend some time without the press of the legislative session to examine this, to get some grounding in what's going on. And I think that will help us all as we continue to go through these next months, trying to understand what the ramifications of last summer's decision are near term, and most importantly, I think longer term. I sit at the American Council on Education, which quite honestly, I knew less about when I was at Princeton than I certainly do now. I didn't know, for instance, that the American Council on Education created the GED, the alternative pathway to a high school diploma, and the American Council on Education, if you will, owns the GED. We co-administer it with Pearson. We were asked at the end of World War II to figure out how the soldiers that were coming home could take advantage of the GI Bill. And many of them, of course, had left America to go to the Pacific or to Europe before they graduated from high school. So the perspective here at ACE has always been, in a way I didn't fully and truly appreciate, about access. And so while, yes, our members include Princeton and they include Harvard, they also include another 1,700 higher ed institutions that are, at very different places along the spectrum, community colleges, minority serving institutions, et cetera. So it is from that perspective that I'm talking to you this morning. And I'm going to start as a setup for Art, because he really is the expert in this space. And my setup is to just kind of tell you all in a few minutes how we got to where we were last summer. And that story begins back in 1978. There was a case called Bakke that went to the Supreme Court. Bakke was a case involving the University of California at Davis Medical School. And there was essentially some set-aside slots, if you will, for a different pathway to be admitted if you were from an underrepresented minority. And that was challenged. Let's call it a reverse discrimination case. It was challenged by an individual by the name of Bakke, surprisingly. And what most people don't appreciate is that affirmative action lost in 1978 in the Bakke case. It was rejected by a majority of the Supreme Court. Now, what do I mean by affirmative action? What I'm saying, well, there's a lot of articulations of it, but what I'm talking about is what I think most of us would presume it means or have in mind when we use the phrase. It's, I'm talking about something intended to promote opportunities for a defined minority group within a society to give them access to something that enables them to be roughly equal in opportunity with the majority. In other words, you're getting an opportunity, you're getting a benefit because you are from an underrepresented minority, and the objective is to help you. That's what I'm meaning there by affirmative action. Well, back in 1978, the court said, no, the University of California at Davis cannot do that. It cannot use race to, as the court said, remedy disadvantages cast on minorities by past racial prejudice. Can't do it. But what one justice did say, is, and this was Justice Powell, and no other justice joined him in this opinion in 1978 on this point. He said, but California says there's a substantial interest in having a consideration of race in the admissions process. There's a compelling interest in having student body diversity, because as folks have said and many appreciate, you don't learn as well when you're surrounded by people just like you. You learn from others who are different. And so Justice Powell said that there's a compelling interest that California has in having a diverse student body. Okay, but that was just one justice. It was in 2002 in a case involving the University of Michigan. Most of us have heard about this case. It was called Grutter versus University of Michigan. And in that case, the court said, today we endorse Justice Powell's view that student body diversity is a compelling state interest that can justify the use of race in university admissions. Now, sure, of course, there was a secondary benefit for some applicants. Their race or ethnicity was what some have called a plus factor that actually benefited them or some of them in the admissions process. But it wasn't supposed to be the primary reason for considering race to benefit them. It was to benefit everybody in the class, white, black, otherwise. Now, I will tell you that Ted Shaw, a name that's familiar to some of you, maybe all of you, Ted Shaw is the former president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and he's a professor of law at the University of North Carolina and directs its Center for Civil Rights. Ted has said in many contexts, in many different ways over the years, that back in '78 in Bakke, he was sitting in the courtroom as a student when the Supreme Court issued their opinion. And when he heard that affirmative action had actually been, if you will, thumbs down, but there was this potential for student body diversity to be considered in some context, he said he left the court on that day devastated because he thought for African Americans, Bakke was a loss. Okay, so we had Bakke in '78, Grutter in 2003. And so then what's happened between then and this past summer? Well, there were cases involving the University of Texas at Austin. And there were two cases, two opinions by the Supreme Court, and frankly, the same case. It was called Fisher versus the University of Texas at Austin. And in both of those cases, both of those decisions by the Supreme Court, the screws were tightened on this whole business about the educational value of diversity and the consideration of race. First, in 2013, the majority said, there's got to be a rigorous scrutiny by the courts about this stuff. There's got to be a lot of evidence that the school has to put forward. Schools got to show that they've tried or race neutral, they call them, strategies that didn't work. And there was more emphasis in 2016 on that evidence when the Supreme Court heard the cases again. But both times they supported the idea of the educational value of a diverse cohort of students that would have permitted some consideration of race in the admissions process. And that was the setup for this summer. And as many of us have thought, and it's been mentioned already this morning, we kind of saw the writing on the wall. Well, the lawyers saw the writing on the wall because of these screws tightening that I mentioned. And also, of course, the Supreme Court changed. There were different justices on the court this summer than there were in 2016. And now I'll turn it over to Art.
Thanks, Peter, and good morning. And thank you to both chairs and the committee for the kind invitation and the opportunity to share some information, as was rightly noted, in this very intense time of higher education work and student applications for the next cycle affected by the decision. Let me just pick up where Peter left off. So big picture, we've got that 45 years of history where the court has continually affirmed the ability of institutions to consider an applicant's racial status as one factor among many to advance his forward-looking educational benefits of diversity tied to institutional mission. The two cases that came before the court, one involving Harvard, one involving UNC, raised similar claims of discrimination at core, challenging the consideration of an applicant's race. Students for fair admission, the plaintiff in both of those cases, expressly asked the court to expressly overrule the 45 years of history that Peter has just given you. In its decision in favor of SFFA and against UNC and Harvard, the court declined to expressly overrule that precedent, but I think it is fair to say it virtually eviscerated much of that precedent in the net effect of the ruling of the court. It ruled under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1966 that governs institutions of all institutions of education that are recipients of federal funds, as well as under the Equal Protection Clause that governs public institutions of higher education. That there was an insufficient, and I'm bleeding now into sort of the legal standard that has guided courts for decades, there was insufficient evidence of a compelling interest to justify that consideration of race in admissions for each of the institutions, and that the policy design, independent of that compelling interest, was insufficiently framed, or in legal terms, narrowly tailored to justify the consideration of race. So in a nutshell, the court said compelling interest that UNC put forth, by the way, the very kind of compelling interest that had been put forth by the University of Michigan and the University of Texas successfully previously, were insufficiently concrete or coherent. They were too amorphous and elusive to justify this consideration of race in admissions. And with respect to the design of each of the policies, the court ruled that the use of race in holistic review was really a classification used as a negative factor that impermissibly stereotyped students based on their race. The court also said that each of the policies lacked the necessary endpoint in time by which such consideration of race would be considered. Another notable point that was inconsistent with past precedent, because past precedent had not, even though it had recognized the need for some endpoint, it hadn't actually required the precise endpoint in time that the court, with its new composition, now required. So it is a significant, bottom line, it is a significant shift in the legal landscape that affects higher education institutions. At the same time, and notwithstanding the point that it is a significant shift legally, I also want to recognize that I think much of the social media and press around the decision has overblown the practical impact of the decision itself. And to make that point, I want to elevate a couple of points that the court raised as it concluded its decision in the context of its new rules with respect to the consideration of an applicant's racial status. Number one, in that decision, the court was very clear to say universities may define their missions as they see fit. An important foundational point to say, and in fact, the court recognized that the mission orientation around the diversity and inclusion goals that Harvard and UNC had articulated were in fact commendable and plainly worthy, in their words, just insufficiently concrete and precise to justify that consideration of race. More to the point, and where the practical rubber hits the road for the purposes of both institutional action and how applicants can think about what they say and what they do in the context of their applications, I'm going to read one small segment from the court's concluding paragraphs. Nothing in this opinion that bars the consideration of an applicant's racial status in admissions should be construed as prohibiting universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race affected his or her life, be it through discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise. The touchstone of an individual's identity must be with respect to challenges bested, skills built, or lessons learned, not the color of their skin. So translated, what does that mean in real terms? I think fairly and objectively, you can take that language coupled with the earlier language I alluded to from the court's opinion to say that this court has prohibited the consideration of an applicant's racial status in the admissions process, but has permitted mission-aligned qualities to be elicited and discussed in essays, in interviews, in teacher and counselor recommendations that may expressly include a discussion of the applicant's racial experience, perspectives, or passions. What the court very clearly did as well was limit its ruling to the four corners of the application. There is nothing under Title VI or the Equal Protection Clause in this court's ruling expressly that addresses scholarships and financial aid, outreach and recruitment, pipeline and pathways programs, or data collection. Now, let me, in the same breath as I'm saying that, want to be very clear that I think it is a mistake to then conclude, therefore, there are no implications of this decision in some of those realms, because the very principles that the court articulated around what is or isn't a compelling interest, for instance, has play in the context of other Title VI and equal protection issues that institutions would be examining as they might consider the continuation of certain race-conscious practices. And so I think it's important to recognize that nuance. Bottom line, we are dealing with a new legal landscape with implications in various facets of enrollment policy and practice, certainly squarely on admissions. And the big picture for practical terms is, I think, nothing should prohibit a student from telling their full lived experience, telling their full story, sharing their interests and passions, the very kind of questions that colleges and universities tend to ask around essay questions or in interviews, so that the institution can understand who that student is around the very kind of qualities it is seeking to advance as it is admitting and composing a class. Let me turn it back to Peter for sort of wrap up on big picture implications building off of that. Peter?
Yeah, so Art emphasized quite correctly that the decision doesn't go anywhere other than toward the factual circumstances that were presented in the case. And those circumstances were admissions processes and policies at the University of North Carolina and at Harvard University. In both of those factual circumstances were teased out during trials with evidence, witnesses, documents. The trial judge, there weren't juries in either of these cases. The trial judge listened to all of that evidence in each of these cases, and then each trial judge issued an opinion. And then those opinions and that record, as we call it, was the basis for the Supreme Court decision. And so to lawyers, it doesn't surprise lawyers at all that they issued an opinion only about the facts and the case presented, because we learn in law school that judges aren't supposed to issue advisory opinions. They're not supposed to take a hypothetical and speak to it. And so what we do as lawyers is we say, okay, the court said the following relating to those facts. What's that going to mean to us under our circumstances? If we're challenged doing this other thing, what can we learn from what the court said in that case? And I think that's a lot of what's going to be going on, certainly this year on campuses and in the future, not just around admissions, but around other issues like financial aid and scholarships, the kinds of programs and activities on campuses that create belonging, the types of programs that help to sustain students to go through school and graduate, be successful. And there will be a lot of questions of, what sort of what I call race-informed program design. And when does that start to appear or look or actually be like a race-exclusive program that's not available to somebody but for their race? The latter clearly would be challenged and probably challenged successfully if it's exclusive based upon one's race in terms of benefits of that program. The former, where it's informed, if you will, in program design by the race and ethnicity of the student body that it's trying to serve, more likely that's going to be appropriate, maybe even encouraged if it's done well. So these are the kinds of things that are going to be going on for the remainder of this academic year in different contexts. One of the things I've learned at ACE is one size absolutely does not fit all. What's going to work at Wesleyan may not work in Storrs at the University of Connecticut and vice versa. What's going to work for a community college student who is trying to pull 6 credits while working 2 jobs may not work for another student who has come straight out of a prep school, albeit having been a scholarship student at a prep school and has found his or her way to a place where fortunately he or she is financially supported, but all he or she has to do is focus on studies. So that's really the context where we are at. Now, you might say, so what are lawyers predicting about this? Well, I'll just suggest to you what one of our really esteemed colleagues that spent a long time serving as general counsel of major universities said in the days after the decision. He said, as a purely legal matter, it may be somewhere between difficult and impossible to limit the impact of the court's ruling to admissions. And we're already seeing that sort of thing. We're already sensing that there will be challenges to what many call DEI initiatives. I'm not sure when diversity and inclusion became words that were problematic in the United States. But somehow when you put those together and you say DEI in many states, it's a challenge to explain and support what schools are doing in their programs or activities that have a DEI component or a DEI set of objectives. Those are probably being challenged in many places these days based upon either a supposition of what the Supreme Court said this summer or an extrapolation of what it might mean in another context. So I'll stop there and invite Art to offer some comments before hopefully we can open it up to all of you and try to answer your questions.
Yeah, no, I would agree with all of that. I think the big picture for awareness is you sort of think about, I work day and night with admissions and other enrollment officials around the country. And I try to think about the question of race in admissions and broader enrollment practices and what that means. And I think just going back for a second to sort of the political top lines, the conventional wisdom, oh, the court wiped race out of the admissions question is technically not true. The Chief Justice actually just said at the end of the opinion, there are certain limited facets that we're going to actually embrace in the context of what we're doing. And so I think it is important just to wrap up, to distinguish between the prohibited consideration of racial status, the permissible consideration of racial experience, and to go to a point that Peter made more broadly, that there are other qualities that may be associated with expertise or passion or commitment, or simply the subject matter where you've got experience in advancing diversity goals or racial justice goals that may be very relevant to an institutional interest that the courts have for years not said are subject to Title VI because those aren't tied to your racial or ethnic status. And so I think there is a realm of activity where institutions can act. We have now clearly a new segment of activity where we can't. It's going to be very important to navigate this space with care.
Peter, Art, thank you very much. We're going to get to questions in just a moment, and I have one, but I do just want to let folks know that we have really 3 sections of this forum, and I just want to lay it out for people who are watching, including our members. So the next one is going to be at noon, approximately to 12:45. We're going to have a panel from Hartford Promise and some students with their thoughts about the decision and kind of the road forward. And then at 12:45, and this is our last panel until 2, we're going to have the voices from some of our institutions of higher education represented, including UConn and Yale University and Wesleyan as well. So we thank those folks for sticking around. Question I have from either Peter or Art is, can you help us put this into context in terms of how many students, how many institutions of higher education, you think will be impacted? I saw some reports that, it was somewhere, I don't know, around 150,000 students across the country. And I think the explanation for that is that this is kind of most prevalent an issue in terms of race-based conscious decisions at, our most selective, most competitive schools. And so anyway, I just wonder if you could, as folks are watching this, kind of put that into perspective in terms of, you could be specific to Connecticut or more broad if you want. Thanks.
Peter, I'll kick it off and then you can amplify if you like. I would say this, I think there are several hundred institutions that are generally considered to be selective institutions. And those are certainly where you're going to see the most significant and direct impact from this court's admission ruling. But I think there's a kind of myth out there that this is really only a case about selective institutions. And I think the impact is much broader, because just from my own experience and sort of knowledge of the general information and data that's out there, there are a significant number of institutions that have in an array of enrollment policy and practice included certain race conscious, race status conscious practices. Peter addressed earlier, the issue of financial aid and scholarships, including, by the way, privately endowed scholarships that are managed or administered by the institution are subject to Title VI issue liability for the purposes of that institution. And in my experience, somewhere between 5 to 8% of most institutions, selective or not, will have some component of those privately endowed scholarships that have some element of race attached to them. So big picture and bottom line, I think it's a mistake to assume this is only an issue for selective institutions for education. I think it's going to reach into a wide array of scholarship practices that extend well beyond selective institutions. I also think there are certain discrete facets of some recruitment and outreach policies and practices that may be implicated in that context as well. So I think it's a bigger picture impact than some would argue. Peter, you may have something you want to add to that.
Well, I'm just going to give an example. It's in the nature of a hypothetical. I want to be frank here. I'm not talking about a particular school I have in mind, but I had a particular awareness in the months leading up to the court's ruling as I was driving through a very remote portion of a southern state. And I was thinking about the fact that I come from a family of educators. My wife was a K-12 teacher. My daughter and son-in-law, my sister just finished a career as a K-12 teacher. And here's what I was thinking about. In the section of the state I was driving through, I passed by a regional university, and I thought, well, this ruling, when it comes out, is going to apply to undergraduate admissions, sure, but it's also going to apply to graduate admissions. And in both their undergraduate and graduate admissions process in this particular regional college's School of Education, to follow the law, they would not be able to consider the race of a male applicant. And let's say that this school really was hoping that there could be some more Black male teachers teaching in the K-12 level, particularly people who are interested in the K-8 level. And technically speaking, that School of Education, even if it is not within a highly selective institution, to follow the court's ruling, would not be able to take the race into account of the applicant, full stop. Now, as Art said, there will be a lot of things that they can tease out of the application, and there can be race-informed experience, race-informed hope for the future about what an individual applicant wishes to do, maybe return to a community and be a teacher, explain how his experience growing up in that environment has shaped his desires, but his race as a factor is no longer able to be considered. And that's a big deal as policymakers try to think about the implications of this decision beyond the most selective institutions. So I offer that just as an example to suggest that there is a kind of a dawning that we're seeing here at the American Council of Education sweeping across the higher education landscape as folks think about the larger implications of this decision, whether they be, as Art said, potentially financial aid, scholarships related, whether they be the sorts of things I'm talking about. And then, of course, as folks work on what is probably more important than ever, which is making sure that the students from underrepresented communities, underrepresented cohorts that are on campus are supported sufficiently to succeed, support it with programs, support it with financial aid, et cetera, so that we don't have what is probably the biggest scourge of the higher education experience, which is dropping out, not being able to go forward, and maybe being saddled with loans that did not help to obtain a degree. And we all know that a higher education degree changes lives.
I appreciate those. I appreciate those final comments, Mr. McDonough, because I think that is one of the things that I am concerned about. Not just at the collegiate level, where we know that there is programming that is targeted sometimes to first generation, low income and minority students, but also even in our high schools and in that position, at that transition from high school to college. We sometimes support initiatives that help students that might come from underrepresented communities make it to college, because we know the matriculation rate is somewhat inexplicably 20 percentage points lower based on their race. And so our next panel, the reason why we put our next panel together was so that we could explore the situation where we have some programming that helps folks. And so I appreciate it. I did just want to take a step back though, and just make sure I understand what, while there's a variety of tools that will still be available to colleges, how effective you think they will be in replacing and achieving the same outcomes in replacing, an more explicit race-conscious admissions process. And my understanding is there are a couple of states where, race-conscious admissions had previously been prohibited. I think California is one of those states. Maybe Michigan. I don't recall. But could you tell us what the experience was in those states? If you're aware of any strategies that they employed and whether or not they were successful or not, and really what were the outcomes measurably different prior to the prohibition as opposed to after the prohibition in those states?
Well, I'm going to turn it to Art for the specifics, but I want to answer your last question as a setup, if you will. Yes, in the earliest moments after in California and Michigan, those institutions were no longer able to consider race as a factor in admissions. There were nosedives in terms of their admissions data. But like everything else in life, you learn and you also get motivated by adversity, right? So institutions that actually said we value the educational value of diversity needed to figure out, okay, well, what are we going to do? We're not just going to say we're doing nothing. So there have been things that they've been doing. The storylines are better. Would they have been better still had they continued to be able to consider race? Of course they would. But Art, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, so just building on what Peter said, with which I totally agree. I think we've got 9 states in the United States that have some form of ban on the consideration of race and ethnicity for public institutions in that state. California was the first, I think, back in the mid to late 90s. Michigan followed the Grutter decision, I think, 2 years after, so it would have been 2005 or 6. Interestingly, and you actually get this story in the amicus briefs filed before the Supreme Court in the SFFA cases, because both the University of Michigan filed a brief and the leaders of the UC system filed a brief to tell their story about what happened in the wake of those voter initiatives. And what's remarkable is you've got 2 very different states at 2 very different points in time, and they told what, in my view, was essentially the same story. A dramatic plummet on racial diversity in the wake of a decision. And to Peter's point, really a clawing back to find what are the strategies that will work, how do we learn from past mistakes, and how do we address ongoing gaps. I think the storyline they ultimately told was important in any legislative context to recognize. There is no silver bullet. There is no single policy that is going to sort of somehow with a magic wand change the landscape. It requires tireless investment. It requires investment and coupled with leadership at the institution and systemic levels. And it requires the right levels of funding in design to assure you've got that rich mix of policy and practice designed toward those fundamental equity, and I would argue non-discrimination goals that are part and parcel of any state system. I think the bottom line from what we hear from Michigan and California is they are certainly approaching in sort of broad ways levels of where they were before. Peter's correct. It probably would have been higher, but far the setback. But it is still not, they're not exactly where they want to be. That, the pattern in California is different for different institutions. And so this remains very much a work in progress. and a point of continuing engagement and learning around what is working and what is not. It is really hard work. The last point I will make is a lawyer's point. I think there is some general sense that there was an over pivot by the legal community in California in the wake of Prop 209, like an over interpretation of the prohibition. I think there's been some moderation on that, recognizing some of these more nuanced practices very much along the lines of the Chief Justice's express recognition of racial experience being permissible, even though consideration of status is not. So I think it is a mix of factors, and it's complicated. And I wish I could give you a clearer, simpler answer, but unfortunately, that's not reality.
Thank you very much for that answer. I'm going to ask if any other member of the committee, I've got a couple more questions to ask, but I wanted to give other members of the committee an opportunity to ask a question if they wanted to. I see Representative Johnson's hand is up. She's online. Representative Johnson.
Thank you so much.
Hold on, Representative Johnson. You're can't hear you right now. Is there a reason why? You want to try again?
Better?
There you go.
Is that better? You hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, good. Sorry. I was just thanking everybody. So I will make that part brief and I'll get right to my question. I do appreciate the expertise here, and I know that we are home to one of the military academies. And as I understand from this new decision, there were carve outs for the military academies. And I just wonder, based on your expertise, what you think that might hold for what Connecticut could do here or would do, given that it seems as though the door was left open there for compelling interest, as far as I read it.
Well, I'm just going to probably set up again, Art, the expert here, with my take on it. None of us know exactly what kind of back and forth went on between the 9 justices on the court or their law clerks that led to what is a footnote in the majority opinion that relates to the military academies. But what we all do know, those of us that listen to a very long set of oral arguments, is that the Solicitor General of the United States very adeptly spoke about the military academies, but more importantly, perhaps, a brief that was submitted that was relating the military academy's own compelling interest for the consideration of diversity, consideration of race, I should say, listed as number 3 of their reasons of the educational value of a diverse cohort of students. They had reasons number 1 and 2 that have to do with national security interests and have to do with the unique nature of what their graduates do. Now, we might extrapolate and we might say, well, maybe medical schools articulating their own compelling interests more uniquely and differently than the broader higher education compelling interest. Maybe they'd have a chance to say something that would be meaningfully different than what the court considered last summer. So I think there will be a lot of schools, shall I say, schools within institutions that are going to look carefully at this West Point decision, just as you correctly note, the military or military type academies and programs that exist in Connecticut and elsewhere will be looking to see, is the court truly going to be receptive to the potential for another type of compelling interest, enabling the consideration of race in admissions? Art?
Yeah, I would just, I agree totally with that. Let me just elevate for you the core of the interests that were rejected by the Supreme Court here, so you have a sense of the general nature of those interests: promoting the robust exchange of ideas, improving teaching and learning, fostering innovation and problem solving, preparing engaged citizens and leaders, breaking down stereotypes. Admittedly broad, by the way, also the very interests that the court had approved on prior occasions. So you've really got a kind of inconsistency with the court's rhetoric that it's following precedent, when I think indisputably it's not in this case. But it opens the door. If that one footnote with respect to military interest is an open door, what are the other more substantial and concrete interests? To Peter's example, I think the medical school and sort of the healthcare disparities is the obvious one. How many other kinds of interests? I've worked with a number of business schools around the country, advancing better decision-making for the purposes of bottom line business decisions can be framed in a much more specific way than even the kind of interest that I've just articulated. So I think there is a open door. I think the $64,000 question is whether this court, given its composition, whether that open door is an open door to something that's real or was a rhetorical need, given the way that the Solicitor General had so really expertly articulated those interests that were not squarely before the court.
Thank you both. Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to ask the question and for this answer. Appreciate it.
Are there any other members of the committee that want to ask a question? I have one, I don't see any hands going up, so I'm going to ask one final question. It's going to be an exit question. I hope to ask everybody, all of the panels, which is, you're addressing now a panel of state legislators. We're all members of the Higher Education Employment Advancement Committee. And we've got a couple months before our next legislative session begins. Are there ideas, guidelines, recommendations you think you would offer to us as state legislators in terms of a state response that would help ensure that the environment is healthy, is welcoming of diversity at our campuses, and also within the boundaries of the Supreme Court decision? Is there an action that you think that we should be considering moving forward?
Well, why don't I just start? And it's going to be apologetically high level, as opposed to here's a precise thing you can do. Maybe Art's got a few of those, but picking up on what I said at the outset here, I think it is tremendous that you're doing this today at this point in the year, so that you can be thinking about these things. And I think I'd like to give you a few sort of framing thoughts. Because I believe that if my experience here at ACE has taught me anything, it is truly that one size does not fit all. And you all are going to know your environments. You all are going to know where you need to lean in far better than I could ever know down here. So first and foremost, do no harm. Do no harm. One size doesn't fit all. We want to have a magic bullet. We all do. And we want to use the levers that we have available to us. I've never been a policymaker, but I imagine if I was, I would want to have policy that's my lever. And I would probably be told to hesitate pulling it if it's going to impact everybody and all institutions. So that's number one. The other is encourage experimentation. Justice Kennedy, in those Fisher cases that I talked about, Justice Kennedy, now retired, but wrote the majority opinion in Fisher too. He spoke to institutions being laboratories of experimentation. And one of the reasons that he did not come down on the side that many folks had thought he would, of opposing the University of Texas at Austin, was because he recognized that institutions need some freedom to do things in their own context to see if they work. So, I said before, what works at Wesleyan may not work in Stores, and that's the experimentation. We need to have the University of Connecticut and Wesleyan have the ability in their context to see what works. And it's going to take a while to figure out what works and what doesn't work. The other is, and maybe this is where policymakers really can step in, encourage and support awareness at the K-12 level, families, awareness of what opportunities exist, encourage and support welcoming by the institutions, encourage and support, most importantly, I think, accessibility. And that's going to be financial aid first and foremost. It's also going to be levels of transparency. So people, families, students can actually figure out how much is it going to cost me? And then helping them to see that there's a way to get there.
I'm going to echo a little bit of Peter, but come at it from a slightly different angle on his point that, there is no silver bullet here. I would just elevate from my experience of having worked in this space for now decades, what you learn on the ground with institutions of higher education that, yes, are very different, that the isolated issue that may be the headline of the day is one issue within either an admissions realm or a broader enrollment realm. And the minute you change that, you've just affected 10 or 12 or 20 other facets of policy and practice. And so while we think about these issues in isolated ways, because that's how we have to get our heads around them, and this is certainly a moment, I would argue, for institutions to be recalibrating their sense of mission and commitment around issues of equity in the wake of a decision that has now removed one consequential tool from their toolbox. The notion that you would legislate from on high around that realm of issues, I agree with Peter, is I would proceed very carefully and very deliberately, because I think what you often don't see, the unintended consequences of that impact, or what it does to sort of the disruption of the broader design. And then I would say, in terms of what to do, I think thinking systemically to make sure, number one, and again, I don't have the expertise around Connecticut, but I would say from a broad standpoint, that you want to have a very effective longitudinal data system that really tracks student outcomes and investments from K to 12 through post-secondary. That becomes a foundation for evaluation. Figuring out how you can advance equity interest through funding models that will support institutions that serve priority populations. And this focus on transparency of and need-based aid to those students and families that need it, and the ability to understand that pathway even as early as in middle school, so that you begin to build the awareness and understanding that, yes, college can be for me too, is really important.
Thank you for that response, and thank you for your time. We are right at just a few minutes after noon, so we're still I'll give us credit for still being on schedule. So Peter and Art, thank you for your expertise, and we may lean on you again in our next legislative session up in February if you're up for it.
Thank you very much.
Very, very happy to be here and very happy to help as we go forward. Good luck to you all.
Great. Thanks again. Okay, our next panel here is, I'm going to bring up Richard Sugarman with Hartford Promise and his team, and we'll let Richard introduce his team. And maybe, Richard, you could begin by explaining to folks who are not familiar with Hartford Promise what it is and your mission, and then we'll give you each a few minutes to give us your reaction to the Supreme Court decision, and what you think are some next steps and things that are important. And I think this is a good transition from what we just heard in terms of advice from our legal experts. So with that, Richard, thank you again for helping us put this together, and I'll turn it over to you and you can introduce the rest of your team. Okay? Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Senator Slapp, Senator Representative Haddad. Thank you very much. Really glad to be here. Such an important topic. I'm going to let each of the folks with me on the panel just introduce themselves, but I'm Richard Sugarman. I'm the president of Hartford Promise, and I'll describe Hartford Promise a bit to you after our other folks have had a chance to introduce themselves.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Sivan Hines. I'm Senior Director for College Partnerships and Scholar Success at Hartford Promise.
Good afternoon. My name is Yamilet Lopez. I am a UConn alum and now work at UConn.
Hello, everyone. My name is Richardson Merson, and I am a senior at Southern Connecticut University.
Now, just also say they're both Promise scholars, and Richardson is on the board of Hartford Promise. So my boss is here with me today. So, I do want to just make one comment. I really appreciated the the attorneys providing us with that context and that framework and that history. But they use the term a nosedive. University of Michigan or State of Michigan and California both experienced a nosedive in diversity right after the ruling that they are currently just trying to get back to. UCal Berkeley is still not even close to being there. But I just want to say that nosedive is about many thousands of people. It's about lost opportunity, not just for those people, but for the state of California, state of Michigan. It's about real people. And I don't want us to have that same nosedive experience. I don't want us to not find Yamilet and Richardson and have them somehow not have the opportunity and the many hundreds and thousands of them that Connecticut needs. So I just wanted to make that a little more personal. Hartford Promise is a place-based scholarship and college success program. And it's really simple. In order to be a Hartford Promise Scholar, you need to live in Hartford. You need to go to Hartford Public High School. You need to have a 3.0 GPA or better. You need to have 93% attendance or better. Every student who does those 4 things becomes a Promise Scholar. They get a $20,000 scholarship to go to any college or university in the country. And they also get a full array of supports and services because, again, what do we want? We not only want students to find the right college and opportunity, we want them to be successful in that college. So those supports and services become particularly important in addition to the importance of the scholarship. 90% of our scholars are students of color. 75% come from low-income families. 70+% are first-generation college students. They've endured many challenges, and they have pressed forward and been disciplined and focused and accomplished everything that's been asked of them and more. They deserve to be Promise Scholars. They've earned it. They also deserve every opportunity that's in front of them. And you'll hear a little bit more from Richard and from Yami about what they've done with this. Our scholars, we currently, and again, I want to make a point, this is a large scale program. It's not about a couple lucky scholars. There are currently 510 Hartford Promise Scholars going to 90 different colleges all over the country. Approximately 75% of them are going to Connecticut colleges and universities, even though they have the full array of choices, just like we would want for our own children. And they're succeeding at a 76% rate. They're graduating college at a 76% rate and becoming part of Hartford's economy, Hartford's communities, or Connecticut's economy, Connecticut's communities, and really part of a talented, diverse, growing workforce, which is something we all need in Connecticut, but they need and deserve. That's a little bit of the demographics and background in terms of Hartford Promise. I'll also just say just one more thing. We have college partners who work with us. UConn, both Nathan and Mona are great partners of ours. We have approximately 140 Promise Scholars that go to UConn, succeeding at least that 76% rate. And UConn is a partner in that they match our scholarship and they match our supports and services so that students have additional financial support. And there are 9 other partner colleges, including UHart and including St. Joe's and so on. So Hartford Promise has worked really hard to leverage what it is doing for scholars into additional support, additional financial support and otherwise for Promise Scholars at these colleges and universities. Savon, I'll let you.
You want to talk about reaching back?
Go right. Go ahead.
Okay. Hello again. So I wanted to add to one thing Richard didn't mention, which is to Representative Haddad's question about the work of access in high school. So we also have a full Reaching Back team that is working with the students in high school, starting knowing we share district data. Hartford shares it with us. So knowing in 9th grade who might qualify and continuing to work and showing them the promise part of this, that if they stay on track, they can then attend college with a lot of support. Personally, my own educational background, I'm a board certified pediatrician. I attended college and med school in our neighboring state at Brown University in Rhode Island, and moved here a year ago specifically to join Connecticut do towards the work that they are doing in diversity and equity and inclusion. In my role now with Hartford Promise, I have the privilege of leading our team in our direct work with our 500 plus scholars, and we have 250 plus recent college alumni who are here entering the workforce. Also work with our college partners and employers in the state of Connecticut. And what I've seen is really three major points related to today. One, that the need for affirmative action in higher education in Connecticut is still very critical. It's really patently false to say that historical injustices have been erased. If you look at Connecticut itself and you look at data from Connecticut, there's a huge discrepancy in school accountability indexes. When you look even within Greater Hartford and you compare Avon, Simsbury, West Hartford to Hartford, there's not a level playing field to start with. Number two, our students, once they get the access to college, are succeeding, they're soaring, they're becoming leaders, not only in their colleges, but in workforces and in community. And we have a number of them who are working in various roles, including 3 current college students who are working as Senate interns right now. And then lastly, what I'm hearing from Connecticut employers is not only are they facing a workforce shortage that you all know about in Connecticut, but they're facing a huge workforce shortage when they're looking to diversify their workforce. They see the benefits, they know the benefits of increased profitability and thought with a diverse workforce. They're telling us they need more diverse college graduates, not less. Thank you.
Can I just ask Richardson, and Yamaleth goes by Yami, so I'm gonna refer to her as Yami if that's okay. But what would you like to throw into this conversation? What would you like to either talk about yourself, your own experience, and how you think this ruling might have affected you or might affect other students?
I can go first and say, I went to Capital Prep High School and I had the opportunity to go to UConn with a lot of money in scholarships. So that was the way that I was able to fund my education. And now working at UConn again, my job there is to advise students who are coming from lower income first-gen families. So again, a lot of the struggles that us underrepresented students face is that funding is usually an option that would help us succeed in college, again, with Hartford Promise and all of that. But again, I think my experience was very lucky and very unique, and to say that the work that I'm doing, working with higher education students, is possible with the opportunities that I've gotten with the funding and just working towards being a higher education employee. With that being said, I think the scholarship and funding that Hartford Promise does and gets to support other Hartford students is something that more than what we cover should be offered to them in a way that this opportunity, again, that Hartford Promise gives to students should be supported and funded for more schools in Hartford. I think the work that we do should be expanded as much as we can. And with that, and the solution to that is just to receive more funding and to just to support students is one of the things that can give students an opportunity to succeed at a higher education level.
For me, I have a similar experience. Both of my parents are immigrants. Well, I only stay here with my mother, and my father's still in Haiti. And it's 4 of us. And I went to Hartford Magna Trinity College Academy. And graduating from there, I had Hartford Promise there for me and my older sister to give my mom the funding to have both of us in college at the same time and have the opportunities that we have right now. And my older sister right now, she's a nurse at St. Francis, and I hope after I graduate to become a public accountant in Hartford with Ernst & Young. And yeah, and without the opportunities that Hartford Promise or, you know, that programs that, you know, are there to help minorities or people that might not have the same level playing, the same playing field or same advantages as others, those programs are the reason that I'm able to be here today.
Thank you, guys. I'm gonna give you a chance to share a lot more. You have more to share, and I'm sure it's a little nervous, right? It's a little nervous. It's okay. Understandable. I just a couple of comments beyond Hartford Promise. This wasn't intended to be a Hartford Promise promotional event, but I appreciate that it's meant so much. And this is really full circle, right? This is the definition. You know, Yami is a Promise scholar who went to UConn and is now working at UConn to help UConn be a better institution. I mean, it doesn't get much more full circle than that. But I just wanted to just a couple of comments. One, preference has not gone away with this affirmative action ruling. It's only gone away for one population. It's only gone away for students of color. Preference still continues to exist for the wealthy. Preference still continues to exist for legacy, still continues to exist for athletes. We don't realize, you know, how many athletes, you know, take spots away from that pool. Just a couple of data points on this. The top 1% of the economic strata are 10 times more likely to go to an Ivy League school than the bottom 30%. The top 1% are 10 times more likely to go to an Ivy League school and be in an Ivy League school than the bottom 30%, 10 times more likely. At one school, Dartmouth, 23% of the current students from Dartmouth are in the top 1%. Only 3% are from the bottom 20%. So there's huge disparities here. And we tend to focus on these most selective schools, highly selective schools. One, because we realize they have an enormous amount of power and influence among their students and among their graduates and among their network as it just ripples out. So they're not the largest population of students, obviously, because they're very selective, but they have extreme power and influence. So those numbers I find striking and almost unbelievable. I had to look at them many times to make sure I wasn't looking at just 10% more likely, 10 times more likely if you're in the top 1%. At the same time, the number of Pell eligible students from moderate and low income families has declined across the country, consistently declined. And I'm going to give a shout out to a couple of our schools. Yale is an exception to that. Yale has increased their number of Pell eligible students by 8% over the last 10 years. They now have, I think the number is, let me check. I think the number is 23% of their students are Pell eligible students. UConn has also done a great job in increasing their percent of Pell eligible students by 3% to 21% right now. So you have to look at both sides of this equation in terms of the preference that continues for wealthy students and the effort that at least a couple of our, and Wesleyan also has a very good record with 18% of Pell eligible students at Wesleyan, the effort to secure more. We don't want that to take a nosedive. None of us want that to take a nosedive. We'll lose all this talent. Bear with me one second. I just want to talk about one other piece of this. And I think it's an important point that the attorneys made in terms of that one of the strategies that will happen here is that students can talk more and that colleges can encourage them to talk more about their experiences, about adversity, about dealing with racism or dealing with various challenges. And I think that's very promising, and I think that's very important. I just want to say one thing about that to make this more real and personal. There are a lot of young people who don't want to talk about racism that they've experienced, adversities and trauma that they've experienced, challenges with poverty that they've experienced. That's a big ask to ask of anyone to put that out there. So I'm just hoping that while we see that as an important tool in terms of making sure that we do have diverse institutions, that we are sensitive about how that gets actualized and applied. We're dealing with real people, young people, when we expect that of them. Do you want to add anything to that, Simone?
Just to that point of dealing with young people, we are also dealing with young people who need to, many in our cities in Connecticut have suffered a lot of self-esteem issues. And so then to hear in any way that affirmative action is under attack means they don't want me at this school. When I talk to our students, right, they need to feel like they are wanted and that it is worth the effort of them trying to get in. And so schools putting all the burden on the universities is not going to be a successful way. It's part of what's happened in Michigan, despite many efforts that they went through to try and change that. So it's got to be from every level, realizing that and encouraging students. And I would have a lot more to say about the need to fund guidance counselors in schools in a more equitable way too, if you want to have kids getting into college.
Yami and Richardson, can you talk a little bit about, do you mind if I can you talk a little bit about the importance of that feeling of belonging, that feeling that the institution, sort of radiates to you, and how important that is to you and maybe to other students, that idea of belonging?
I can speak for myself and say that UConn is trying to do its best, trying to serve, again, at a predominantly white institution, having students of color coming from first-gen low-income families. It is not to say there's a fact that sometimes I would feel out of place at a university like that. But again, just trying to find connections socially with like clubs and organizations. But again, my experience at UConn, I got more professionally involved. So I did a lot of peer mentoring with students. I did a lot of just mentoring because I know coming from Hartford and going to a school in Storrs, it is just a culture shock. And again, my job advising students at UConn now is my support for them to make sure that they're feeling culturally involved, for them to say that they're getting involved on campus, making sure that they're doing their best to fit in. A sense of belonging is very important. And one of the main tools to be successful at a college like that, you have to do your own part in putting yourself out there. And I think, again, I wasn't that socially involved on a campus like that, but professionally, I did gain a lot of experience. And one of my main goals now is to just give back at a university that gave me what I did experience there.
I think that the sense of belonging is very, very important, especially since college is like, it's not easy and is very different. It's like you get there your freshman year and it's a lot of people, they, have a hard time adjusting to that college life where you're by yourself. And that sense of belonging, it helps you get through a lot of those hard times because you have like somebody there for you, especially you're away from your family a lot of cases. So that sense of belonging is very important, and it's helped me get through a lot of hard times in college.
Richardson, you're a little bit humble. So I want you to share with this group how you've done in school, who you've worked with, and who you definitely are not, you're not hoping to work for. You have an offer on the table that you've accepted, right? So can you just take 30 seconds and be a little more specific about yourself, your major, how you've done?
So I am majoring in accounting, and I've had the privilege to have multiple internships. Sophomore year, summer, I've got to be a part of the WSDA program, which is a program that's their goal is to diversify Wall Street. And yeah, I had the opportunity to work in New York for Gagnon Security and stay there the summer and, learn a lot about finance. And then I've also had a lot of internships in accounting. And last summer I was with Ernst & Young, and I've also had the privilege or the opportunity to get an offer to come back after I graduate to start full time.
It's a full-time position at Ernst & Young. Yeah, you earned that, didn't you? They didn't just give that to you. You earned that. And I think that's a really important point. These students aren't being given gifts. They aren't being given privilege. They are earning everything that they're getting every step along the way. From early in education, right on through education. They've earned it. They're talented. They're smart. They deserve it. So I think it's also important to sort of balance here that we're not just talking about trying to retain some element of preference or privilege. We're trying to really identify and make sure talented young people are able to come forward and have opportunity so that our state can be a thriving, robust state. That's really what we're talking about here. You agree with that? Savon agrees with me on that. Can I just say one other thing about Hartford Promise and maybe speak a little bit to where I think some opportunity lies. I mean, clearly the opportunity lies, I believe, with many colleges and universities to see a program like Hartford Promise, and there's also New Haven Promise, and there's a Waterbury Promise, to see our programs as being a huge source of diverse talent, diverse smarts, and people ready to contribute to our community. I think it's really important that colleges see us that way and maybe work more closely with us. Okay. By the way, I will say, because it came up earlier in the conversation, Hartford Promise is race neutral. You just have to do those 4 things. It turns out that 90% of our students are students of color, but our program and qualifications are race neutral. So I think that's also particularly important in the environment that we unfortunately find ourselves in. I also want to just say that I think this is an opportunity for Connecticut to seize this as a competitive advantage. Connecticut stands for, in so many ways, this conversation today, the policies that speak to diversity, that speak to giving everybody a chance, that speak to raising people up. Connecticut has, I think, here a chance for a competitive advantage in terms of there are many states that don't represent that. And frankly, there are many families, and I think it's clearly the case, I've talked with Nathan about this, I think it's clearly the case that many families from overseas that are considering wanting to send their children to be educated in the United States are not considering those states where they feel like their children are not going to be given opportunity and not going to be safe, not going to be welcomed, not going to belong. They belong here in Connecticut. We've made that clear, and I think we can do even a better job of that and really seize the moment as a competitive opportunity. And the last thing I'll say is, as part of that, wouldn't it be great if there was a Connecticut Promise instead of just a Hartford Promise and a New Haven Promise? We don't have to break everything into little pieces. I know we're really good at that, but we can actually do something statewide. And I think this is one of the things. I mean, clearly the programs are successful. Clearly the young people are successful. You know, I can't imagine a better investment. So I would hope that this might spark some thinking or consideration for why don't we become a Connecticut Promise state and really leverage this.
Thank you all for your presentation. You know, it's, you know, one of the things that the Higher Education Committee very frequently tries to do is to make sure that we elevate student voices here at the committee. You know, Richard and Sivan did a great job. You guys did a better job at representing, you know, the potential of what, you know, an organization like Connecticut Promise can be for students. And so, you know, I look at, you know, many of our urban centers and places where there's a high concentration of low income, first generation minority students, and I see them as real untapped potential for finding folks who can help our state grow and be better. I think about all of the challenges, it's particularly when applying to a selective school around, you know, sometimes the reputation of the school system that you come from, certainly the number of counselors who are available to help and offer expertise, and those counselors connections to admissions offices at some of our great selective institutions. Extracurricular opportunities that might not be as robust in these places. Letters of recommendation. It was interesting. I was reading an article about in the New York Times about some of the advantages that highly selective private high schools have in getting their graduates into highly selective colleges and universities. And they've raised the letter of recommendation to high art form. They know precisely how to address admissions offices, particularly at Ivy League schools and highly selective schools, in order to give their students an advantage. And that's something folks at regular public schools in Connecticut just don't have. And then Lisa, which is not also just knowledge of the process, right? As first generation students know, and I was one myself, when I asked my parents for guidance in applying for college, they were as clueless as I was. And we were hard pressed to find the right kind of advice. I ended up going to college 15 minutes away from where I grew up. I don't regret that. It was the University of Connecticut. It was a different university then than it is now. I wish I went to the University of Connecticut of today and not the University of Connecticut of the 1980s. They've done a great to increase a job at increasing their reputation. And a lot of that is based on the investment that we made here. But and I appreciate, Hartford Promise's sort of a position in the ecosystem. You mentioned New Haven Promise and Waterbury Promise, other organizations that include Higher Edge and Higher Heights. And then state programs, state funded programs like CONCAP, right? Which, is state funding that's provided to our universities to help first generation low income students transition into college, and also the federal TRIO programs. I was hoping, Richard, you could just describe for the committee a little bit more about the whole ecosystem that's out there for helping first generation low income students move, and what, if anything, you think that we can do to help build that ecosystem out so that it's more capable and we can double on your effort. You mentioned the statewide promise program, but are there other things that we can do?
So I think Sivan also just touched on something. Thank you, Greg, for all of the comments and your personal experience. Sivan mentioned college counselors. Again, if we think of counselors, typical guidance counselors, only a small % of their work can be given to college counseling. And frequently for students in Hartford and other Connecticut cities, that happens way late in the process. So they're missing out on all sorts of opportunities, the students, because they don't have that counseling. So we have found that in high schools where there is a college counselor, a dedicated college counselor, it makes a huge difference, both in terms of student preparation, student thinking about possibilities, student being able to take advantage of those opportunities, higher education opportunities. So I think that's one point for sure. There are a number of programs that exist that are trying to tackle this, but I think they're still a bit scattered and not coordinated. I think there could be a lot of attention given to a more coordinated, state-supported or a guided effort that where the impact of these programs can be heightened and leveraged. We work hard to try to talk to Higher Heights to find out what they're doing, and Blue Hill Civic Association to find out what they're doing, but there's just not a coordinated effort, even in Hartford, and I'm sure not in the state of Connecticut. And your point, it's a really good point, and we learned this early on about certain high schools and certain towns being really well equipped to take advantage of everything. And frankly, a lot of colleges being oriented in their recruiting and in their relationships toward those places where they've had longstanding relationships and where they're familiar and so on. Now, I know that many of the colleges and the colleges sitting here today want to change that, or are in the process of changing that, and have made a lot of progress in that regard. But there's still a tremendous foundation out there where many colleges will swirl around Hartford, but not really come into Hartford. And frankly, I'm just going to say, we also find that with internships, we find many businesses that are looking to fill internships, and they go far and wide all over the country, but they don't necessarily have the kind of robust effort to really uncover the talent that's sitting right next to us here. So I'm not sure what could be done about that, but those are some of the things that I think of, Greg. Please, Simone.
Can I offer 2 concrete suggestions? So one is the way I funded my medical school education was that the U.S. Army paid me to go to medical school because they needed physicians afterwards, right? Both my husband and I did that. And so there's nothing that I know of in Connecticut that ties any potential new scholarships to something that would ask you to work in Connecticut for several years. You could do that for nursing, in particular, other fields that there's a shortage of. And then the other specific one, the number one concern I hear from colleges about student readiness is math and the huge math shortage of math teachers. And so again, what could be done to potentially offer higher salaries, et cetera, for math teachers? Because if you're underprepared in math, it limits your career ability in so many scientific fields and things that students need. So those are 2 specific things.
Great, thank you. I believe Representative Turco has a question. Representative?
Thank you. Thank you all for presenting here today. I really appreciate learning so much about Hartford Promise. I've heard about it, but not at the specifics that you all and what it's meant to your lives. I think it sounds like a really great program, and it should be something that we continue to discuss and strive for a statewide Connecticut Promise rather than only being available to individuals that live in certain communities of the state, right? But I'm thinking you said a lot, Richard, of what I was thinking as you were going through this, that to bring context to our conversation today about using race in admissions, not being able to now because of the Supreme Court case. Universities and colleges are not able to take race into account, but from my understanding, from everything I'm learning, is they could take into account students that come from a program like Hartford Promise as part of their admissions criteria, giving an advantage to students that are part of this program, which we know because of Hartford, the makeup of Hartford demographically, it's going to be mostly students that are from a diverse background. So Richard, you mentioned that this could be a potential opportunity for Connecticut. And I believe you are correct in that we can, utilize programs like yours, help them become more robust. And it's a great opportunity for universities and colleges to be able to help diversify without going against anything with the Supreme Court decision. So I'd love, and I just want to mention before my question, as a former college admissions counselor for a private university here in Connecticut, I wanted to recruit into Hartford. It was one of my assigned geographical areas, but I couldn't even get someone on the phone to be able to, from all the different high schools, to set up an appointment for me to be able to come to the high school and meet with students. I would call and it would just ring, or somebody would say, well, someone will get back to you, and they never would. But when I would call West Hartford or any of the other suburbs, I was immediately given an appointment, access to lots of students, and we could start that admissions process. So a program like yours is creating additional opportunities to help colleges. I wish I just would have called you directly and started to work with the students that you're recruiting. So I'd love to know more about, that opportunity you think that your program and similar programs could create that to get around this Supreme Court decisions to help our colleges, universities be more diverse. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Representative Turco. Thank you. I relate and understand your experience that you had in terms of trying to get in touch with Hartford schools, but I'll say that we still have 12 high schools in Hartford, and we have 2 in West Hartford. So just by design, just by the structure, there's a lot more complexity in terms of Hartford schools. And in those schools, with the exception of a few of them, there's no college counselor to connect with. There's a counselor to connect with who's busy with schedules and all kinds of other things that are not about college counseling. So I just want to say that's the reality. But the other thing I'll say to this is Hartford Promises try to position itself as a way to get through that complexity and be able to make it more convenient for colleges that want to work in Hartford, that want to connect with Hartford students, that want to make sure that they're active and visible in Hartford. We can streamline that, and we have streamlined that. And we can also do the same thing for folks in the high schools in terms of being able to make connections to college. We can be a pathway, a streamlined way to get through that sort of frustration that you experienced. So, and I'm sure that the other Promise programs are positioning themselves the same way. Again, part of the issue is that we've created a very complex K through 12 system in our city, certainly in Hartford, that make a lot of things just more difficult to accomplish. Did I answer your question?
Yes, as far as, universities and colleges having the opportunity to work with organizations like Hartford Promise directly to recruit more diverse students. So that I think makes a lot of sense. And, it seems like University of Connecticut is already taking advantage of that relationship, and I'm sure others are, but definitely will be interested in your perspective going forward on, more statewide approaches on how we can make sure we're tapping into our more diverse urban areas and helping them get into our colleges.
Absolutely. Let's assume that Hartford has been sort of an innovative laboratory for how to do it. And now that we know so much and we've learned so much and their success, this can be expanded throughout the state. I'll also just say, Representative Turco, we've done things like have college days. Now, not a college fair, but college days where we've made it easy for college reps, admissions folks to connect with counselors and to connect with our students, and again, a streamlined, one-time place for them to do that. And also to try to forge those relationships that didn't exist to the same extent with Hartford counselors that it exists with private schools and other suburban schools and so on. So we're willing to try a lot of things to make that work better.
Can I just point out that we haven't talked about it? Hartford Promises funding does not come from the state at all currently, right? So the funding comes from corporations in Hartford, foundations and individuals who believed in this. And so as we go forward, I can tell you lots of things we could do with more funding, more students that we could affect. The promise starting earlier, so students in middle school knew that we had the funding for them, the ability to support students at a higher level, internship opportunities. My list could go on and on and on. So I just want to be clear, right? I think we are doing really good work, but we need more support to grow this program throughout the state.
Thank you. And Richard, I do want to amplify a comment that you made earlier about, income and related to admissions right into the highly selective schools. There's a report, Diversifying Society's Leaders, the Detriments, Causal Effects of Admissions to Highly Selective Private Colleges. It was written by 3 people from very select private colleges, Harvard, and Brown. So the 3 researchers, but they say that the high income admission advantage at private colleges is driven by 3 factors: preferences for children of alumni, weight placed on non-academic credentials, which tend to be stronger for students applying for private high schools that have affluent student bodies, and recruitment of athletes who tend to come from higher income families. Is that kind of consistent, right, with what you're?
It's totally consistent. We're probably looking at the same report. Is that Raj Chetty's report?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're looking at
Yep.
absolutely consistent.
Yeah. So you know, Hartford Promise is based on location, place, right? Not race. Well, can you explain why that is? And because there is this feeling among some that, you know, that base it solely on race, on place rather, right? As a way for the creation of more of these, et cetera, to kind of combat some of the nosedive, right? The question is that sufficient? When Hartford Promise started, there was a conscious decision, right, to have it be based on place. I'm wondering if you could, as we wind up this panel, and also any kind of final comments any of you have, and welcome your thoughts on this. But I'll leave it to you to respond and do your final comments. Thank you.
Yeah, Hartford Promise is created because the city of Hartford is an undereducated community. I think less than 23% college graduations, the seniors from Hartford schools, less than 23% graduate college in 6 years. It's impossible to have a robust, thriving community with that low level of higher education success. And I would say that for any city, any community, but certainly for the state. You know, we want to see higher education success. It changes health profiles, it changes social profiles, changes economic profiles. It is the single most significant factor in all of those in terms of changing those profiles. So I think we want that in our state. And basically we also want a vibrant workforce, a vibrant, talented workforce. So it's easy right now to think of Hartford as the place. That's where Hartford Promise is focused, because we want to change that undereducated profile. But we want that for the state of Connecticut. You know, we helped Waterbury become a Waterbury Promise because we want to see more of this happen. We'd be prepared to do that in other cities. And frankly, we'd be prepared to do that in some of the smaller towns of Connecticut to help them sort of copy and benefit from what we've learned and what we do, so that we can test some in half a dozen or a dozen of the smaller towns also, which also struggle with low higher education rates. So it's a city issue, it's a small town issue, it's a Connecticut issue. And I think that's the way we ought to start looking at it. And it's a moment of competitive advantage to do that. But Richardson, what other comments you want to make sure that people get to hear from you about the affirmative action ruling, or about any of the things we're talking about? Please take a moment and leave them with your thoughts.
Well, I just want to say, it's kind of like a reason that some of these places or have lower education or lower income, or, you know, lower standards of living kind of, and it's because of, you could say, discrimination from the past. And, you know, this because people that lived there didn't have the opportunities that other people had, and it kind of like it's a trickle down effect to the reason that we're where we're at right now. And I think it's very important that we keep the momentum in the right direction and make sure that everyone, you know, the next Richardson or the next Yami has access to these opportunities, so we could continue, you know, making things better. And that's what I would like to say.
Yes, a second. An investment too. Like we said, Connecticut Promise is an opportunity to make change. And I know from Hartford Promise as well, just the change that we've made within ourselves, it just gives a motivation for students to continue to go to higher education, especially me to pursue my master's, because I know the change is there. We just need support and someone to just back us up funding wise, investment wise, making those connections like you all mentioned before, and building those relationships so that students have sort of a promise to themselves as well.
Can't say it any better than that. We'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Richardson, Yami, Sivan, Richard, thank you very much for your testimony. We appreciate your time as well to come and share with us your experience and your knowledge. Thank you very much. You've made our forum richer for your presence. Thank you.
Thanks for letting us be here.
Yeah. Our third and final panel, you can take your seats up here if you would. You've got find your, there you go. You're good. I'll introduce you as you sit. from the University of Connecticut, we have two people. The first is Nathan First. He's Vice President for Student Life and Enrollment Planning and Management at UConn. Additionally, we have Mona Lucas. She's the Assistant Vice President for Enrollment Policies and Strategic Initiatives. We also welcome Amin Abdul Malik Gonzalez, who is Vice President and Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid at Wesleyan University. And last but not least, Jeremiah Quinlan, who's the Dean of Undergraduate Admissions at Yale University. So thank you all for taking all of this time out of your day. I know it's a busy season for you. It's now that it's fall, applications are flooding in. Enrollment has just started. You're starting your process for applications for next year. But thank you very much for being here. We're interested in hearing about your experience, your reaction to the Supreme Court decision, where you are right now in terms of the diversity of your student bodies and what you are doing to ensure that there is as little adverse outcomes as possible as a result of any changes that you might be contemplating in your admissions process. So I'll leave it, I guess, up to you. Maybe we'll start on the right and move left, or either way you want to do it if you worked it out yourselves. But thank you very much. You can offer some opening remarks, and then we'll have time for the committee to ask questions.
Yeah, thank you, Representative Haddad and Senator Slapp and other members of the committee. And I just think it was a really great idea to come together now and have this conversation as the decision is fresh to us. And not only that, to your point, we're at the front end of a process that our high school seniors are going through now, not to mention transfer students and other populations that we serve. Mona, in a minute, I'll turn it over to her and she'll talk about some of the things that we have going on at the University of Connecticut in response to the decision. Mona actually chairs our admitting authorities group at the University of Connecticut, which spans undergraduate all the way through to the medical school. And as you know and heard, this decision impacts all of those areas. We really want to reinforce maybe just a couple quick things that Art and Peter mentioned to you earlier, and that is that our work really begins with our mission. And I think that's just such an important point. And if you look at the mission of the University of Connecticut, of course, we call out diversity, and we're thinking about in what ways do we need to reinforce our commitment to diversity and its role at the university and higher education in general. So we'll continue to do that. The other thing that we acknowledge is that the personal impact that this has or can have has played out before us in ballot initiatives in other places in other states. And a lot of our work that we'll talk about is really meant to mitigate against any potential decline or discouragement that students may experience as a part of a Supreme Court decision that may come across to some students as though higher education doesn't want you, or education doesn't want you in general. And that's something that we're sensitive to, because nothing could be further from the truth on that end. So just to call out before I turn it over to Mona, we've had great success at the University of Connecticut. About 10 years ago, when I arrived at the University of Connecticut, we had about 25% of our entering class at Storrs coming from minority backgrounds. This year, that percentage is 49%. And when you look across our regional campuses, it's even more significant in terms of the growth in minority, first generation, low income enrollment at the University of Connecticut. And so we've made great strides over a relatively short period of time. We've been deliberate in the progress that we've been making at the University of Connecticut. And with that, I think it's best to turn it over to Mona, who can talk about our committee and what they're intended to do, both in the near and the short term, long term.
Sure. Again, thank you so much for having us here today. As Nathan mentioned, I convene a group of admitting authorities at the institution. So we have representatives across all schools and colleges responsible for admitting students to the university. We started to meet very soon after the Supreme Court decision was rendered. And our key goal is to have everyone look at their existing policies that were in place or practices with regard to admission, and identify any of the action steps that now must be revised in order to maintain compliance with the Supreme Court decision. A very key partner in our meetings is a representative from the Office of the General Counsel. So it's a large group of individuals, but it's a safe zone, so to speak, where we can all share kind of what we're doing or what we were doing prior to the Supreme Court decision, and ask questions about specific action steps that the degree to which we can continue those or not, or need to no longer do some of these things. This group is meeting regularly, maybe every 5 or 6 weeks. Probably one of the biggest assignments was asking each of them to outline or to look at their current practice and then outline the things that needed to be changed, and then give us a kind of like an action plan for, in order to be ready for the next cycle, what are the things that need to be changed, who in their organization is responsible for each of these actions, and when does the action need to be in place such that the next cycle of admission is in compliance with the Supreme Court decision. I'd mentioned one other activity that we're undertaking, and that would be to maybe expand our partnerships and communications with our maybe I'd say grow our pipeline programs. For example, like with our partnership with the Hartford Promise, we need to do more of these types of things to ensure that the leaders of these organizations know that we're interested in the students they serve and want to make sure that we send the message that we do want these students at our institution. Another example would probably be some of the initiatives that we're doing with our Alliance schools and offering them opportunities to bring students from their institutions to our campus at our expense, and let them see higher ed kind of in action. So I'd leave it at that.
Hi, Dad, just a couple other things, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues to my left to chat about what's going on at their institution. We had in the past looked at race neutral alternatives, as the Fisher case really required that of us, right? As you know from that decision, the manner in which we considered race in the admissions process had to be narrowly tailored in that way and consider race neutral alternatives. And we'll be pursuing some of those specific things with regard to our selection process, be it information about the neighborhood or the school and these kinds of pieces of information. But it's just important to note that in our hypotheticals in the past, and we'll see how things play out, it was not adequate to mitigate any potential decline or achieve the same level of diversity in their undergraduate student population, in particular at Storrs. If we were to pursue those tactics and those tactics alone. That just makes these new initiatives in terms of outreach, recruitment, and marketing that we will be considering, and considering all the available space that's available to us, that much more important. So taking the programs that Mona talked about and amplifying those, and thinking about those other institutions that have gone before us. The University of Michigan is a great example, and learning from them in terms of what worked for them, what didn't work for them, so that we don't reinvent the wheel and try and create a program that was attempted and failed in terms of ensuring diversity at those institutions. So that's the orientation that we're taking to all of this. The group that Mona chairs will be meeting on an ongoing basis, indefinitely, really, as we continue to experiment, try new things, grow our partnerships and the like, to mitigate any potential decline in diversity at UConn. So thank you for inviting us here, and I'll pass it on to my colleagues.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jeremiah Quinlan. I'm the Dean of Undergraduate Admissions and Financial Aid at Yale, and it's a pleasure to be here and to talk to this group about our efforts, and just to hear two of my favorite people in my work, to my left and my right, to talk to them and hear what they're doing. Similar to the University of Connecticut, we have seen sort of a tremendous transformation in the student body at Yale in the past decade since I've been the Dean of Admissions. This first year class that arrived on campus last month, 60% of them identified as a student of color. We had record numbers of Asian Americans, African Americans, Latinx students in the first year class. We have seen, as Richard Sugarman was kind to point out in the last session, we have seen a dramatic change in the socioeconomic profile of Yale student body. In the past decade, when I became the Dean of Admissions, we only had about 12% of our undergraduates receiving federal Pell Grants. This first year class, the number was 22%. 21% identified as first generation, first in their family to attend college. If you unpack the Venn diagram of students who are identifying in both ways, we actually now have about a third of our students at Yale identify as either first in their family to attend a four-year institution or low income or both. So we talk about how 1 in 3 students on campus is identifying as first generation or low income. And we've doubled, because we've also increased the size of the student body by about 15%. We've doubled the number of low-income students on our campus in the past decade by increasing both the numerator, the proportion of students who are qualifying for federal Pell Grants, and the denominator, the number of students on campus. We've achieved some incredible results. Then we get the Supreme Court decision in June, and we are trying to think about how we can maintain that momentum in a very changed legal landscape. As Nathan just alluded to, if you look at some of the experiences of some selective public flagships in California and Michigan after they were moved for political reasons into race-neutral regimes, it's not particularly encouraging in terms of campus diversity. And at Yale, we feel very strongly that we do not have an opportunity here to sort of wait and figure this out. Wait 4 to 5 years to sort of let the new legal landscape wash through. Because if we take dramatic steps back in diversity of our student body, if we undo decades of work in this area, it will be very hard to build back up. We have spent a decade communicating to students and families about how affordable a Yale education actually is. And we have made tremendous progress in diversifying our applicant pool. And so if we take a step back and students and families and communities start thinking again of a Yale of a generation or two ago, then it'll be very hard to continue to sort of build on the momentum we have had. So we're focusing on trying to mitigate the impacts of the new interpretation of the law in 3 ways. We're obviously changing our selection process. We're doing extensive reader training. We started that last month. Most of my team is all over the country right now, visiting high schools throughout the country, talking to students and parents and educators about Yale. Everyone's due back a week earlier than normal, October 16th, to spend a lot of time training about how to work in a new world that I know Art and other colleagues explained or sort of described a little bit to you a few hours ago. We've asked a new essay question. It's an optional question that gives students an opportunity to talk a little bit more about their experiences and their backgrounds if they choose to do so, but it's not required. We have mentioned already at this forum our good friends at Opportunity Insights Project at Harvard and Brown, Raj Chetty and John Friedman. We are taking their data and harnessing it into our process next year so that we are going to be able to really take a close look at students and applicants applying from what they characterize as neighborhoods with low socioeconomic mobility. So that we can, as a race neutral factor in our process, apply a plus factor to applicants coming from one of the neighborhoods that their data suggests students and families have a hard time breaking through in terms of socioeconomic mobility. And we're going to continue to invest in our whole person review process that takes a very careful look at all the diverse aspects of a student's background. If we can no longer look at a student's race and we're no longer going to have that self-identity variable in our consideration process, we're going to continue to take a very close look at contextual background, high school that students attended, the neighborhood that they are living in, and control for all of those things in our very detail-oriented, person-driven admissions process. We're also investing in outreach. We had 1,000 students and family members on campus for our multicultural open house this weekend. It was very soggy in Connecticut on Saturday morning, as everyone knows. I was worried as I was driving down 91 that we were going to have like 20 people there, but we had 1,000 folks. From all over the Eastern Seaboard for our open house to learn about our academic programs and our the diversity of the Yale student body. We are looking forward to expanding that program in the future. The university has allowed me to hire additional staff members to work directly with students at Yale, alumni at Yale, to run additional programming directed towards 11th and 12th graders from diverse backgrounds who we want to get interested in Yale. The ruling, as I believe are described, left alone our ability to consider students in our pipeline as diverse candidates. So we are going to send students and alumni and admission staff members to as many diverse places as possible. And we have been doing that for a long time, but we're going to try and increase our investment in that area. And just like Mona mentioned, we're going to do what the University of Connecticut's doing and really talk about working more directly with pipeline programs, particular local programs. We have a strong interest in continuing to build the pipeline here in Connecticut of incredibly diverse candidates to Yale. And that means bringing more of these incredible people to our campus for programming, flying them to campus if it's a national program, if it's more local CBO program, bringing them onto our campus for exactly like next year's multicultural open house. I want to have a parallel program for CBO and CAO leaders. And we want to bring some national college organizations to campus for summer programs. This is going to be a major investment for us, but we want to use the opportunity to bring high school students all the way down as early as 9th and 10th grade to campus over the summer so they can get a sense of what it's like to be on our residential campus, how incredible New Haven is as a city, and really invest in those pipeline programs. So we're excited. We've increased the undergraduate admissions budget. We've increased our staffing, and I have spent the last month talking to lots of stakeholders, and I officially, after today, moving into implementation mode for these plans, and I'm very excited.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I'm Amin Abdul-Malik Gonzalez, Vice President, Dean of Admission and Financial Aid. And I just wanted to acknowledge at the outset that how privileged and honored I am to be here, in part because while I am a Connecticut resident now, I'm a native New Yorker and a product of a community-based organization that helped identify talent. And so the discussion around affirmative action, access, opportunity, and belonging is very personal to me. I'm in my 5th year back at Wesleyan, having been there in 2 different iterations, including as an undergraduate student. I identify as a first-generation low-income graduate, came to Connecticut for both high school and college, and have left Wesleyan several times and come back each time because of the institution's commitment to living its values, and had the good fortune of working with Jeremiah very closely on a number of some of these initiatives many years ago. I guess where I would start is to acknowledge the fact that while this decision and ruling was deeply disappointing, it was somewhat expected, and it compounded what was already a very fraught educational landscape with respect to the racial reckoning that the country was enduring, as well as the aftermath of the pandemic that had impact on already marginalized communities. And so we've been thinking through many of these issues even before the decision. Given where we sit at Wesleyan, our applicant pool has more than doubled in the last 20 years. Our selectivity has gone up. We continue to punch in above our weight, if you will, with the resources that we have available, and have implemented a number of decisions and policies to help continue to increase access and opportunity. Before the Supreme Court ruled in late spring, we decided to do away with evaluative interviews, recognizing that they served more, at least in our particular space, to perpetuate privilege and to do anything more. We were test optional prior to the pandemic and have made a commitment to remain test optional indefinitely for some time. Of course, we received, I think, appropriate and beneficial attention over the summer with the university's decision to discontinue any preferences, however small, for legacy candidates. And we've been working very closely with community-based organizations, the National Ed Equity Lab, which is a national program to bring educational opportunities, college merit credit courses for students who participate in the program. And so at Wesleyan, we've been very invested in thinking about this and dealing with the aftermath. We have seen shifts in the sort of demographics of the applicant pool and continue to strive to enroll as diverse a cohort of students as we can, because we have the good fortune of having a manageable applicant pool where we can continue to employ holistic admission, and the ruling did not prohibit our ability to consider students fully and contextually. One of the great challenges that was already alluded to, and I think is so important, is that the burden of responsibility falls on the higher ed landscape, on folks like Jeremiah, Nathan, and myself and others. And we know that students, unfortunately, given the timing of the ruling, late summer, I don't even know at this moment exactly what kind of counsel and guidance they're getting from their schools and families as they try to make their way through what is a very complicated ruling and decision. We decided not to have students submit an optional or required supplemental essay because we saw that as a potential barrier. Well-intended as it might be, you can imagine one student applying to 10 schools and having to write 10 additional supplemental essays, whether optional or required, and what that might mean for them, not to mention the need to, somewhat categorically define themselves in a very singular fashion. The student who has to, testify to their trauma, adversity, resilience and grit in ways that other students who get to speak about their passion for computer science or dance or social justice or other things don't need to. So one of the takeaways from all the work that we're doing, and I've been fortunate enough to collaborate with colleagues across the country on various sessions aimed at amplifying not only our collective commitment to live our values, but our commitment to increase access and make this education more affordable, because public confidence, of course, has diminished given the rising cost of education. But what we've also seen is that it's our charge and burden to continue to address at the secondary and even earlier than that, early outreach, to make sure that students, families, and organizations that support students through the pipeline understand that the return on investment, not just financially, but in terms of opportunity, is there. So we leverage College Board Landscape, which is a tool that provides context. Like Yale, we're going to be implementing the Opportunity Insights data and really triangulating not just the data points, but the various information that is really shared with us. And I do caution myself and my team to think about, when we talk about percentages and sort of the fact that percentage points and diversity as defined by data never fully captures the perspectives of the people who are behind those data points. And that's one of the things that I think is really compromised by the decision, or at least the interpretation of it. So really excited to be in partnership with colleagues to sort of raise the level of understanding about the implications. I wish we had a crystal ball and could forecast out what was going to come. But given what we've seen in other states, there isn't great cause for optimism. The work just gets more difficult, but it's worthy of doing. We didn't sign up for easy. We do the right thing as best we can with what we have available. So thank you for having me.
All right, we're haggling over who gets to ask the first question. And I, should say we open it up to committee members too. But you mentioned data. Let me just start by asking you, how confident are you? And anyone or all of you can answer this. But I think Mona, you mentioned that I think it was 49%, right, of people who identify as minority who are at UConn now. If we were going to have this same kind of forum a year from now, is it going to be less, do you think? And that's, I know a little crystal ball, but how big is this challenge? I just want to kind of make sure people understand where the rubber hits the road, what is going to be happening on our college campuses, and not just publics too. I would ask our friends from the private schools as well.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Senator Slab. I would not venture to guess, actually, what the percentage, what might happen to a number necessarily, but that more just respond on what I know we're going to do to ensure that we are opening additional opportunities and creating space for us to grow and reach students that maybe we haven't done such a good job reaching historically. We know that of higher education, right? It's not any new information, especially for us, predominantly white institution. So, if anything, maybe we ought to just seize this opportunity that we have to explore that space. And I think some of our earlier panelists talk about some of those ideas that might be out there in terms of how do we better pave the way and help students understand the opportunities that are in front of them. But I would be very hesitant to throw out a specific percentage in terms of how we think this may play out.
Yeah, I don't think I'll give you a number. Publicly available data and research on this suggests it could be pretty dramatic. In the Harvard case that just was decided by the Supreme Court, there's dueling economist forecasts that analyze the process. But in both instances, they talk about sort of drops that are somewhere between like 40 to 50% in the students of color that are admitted to Harvard based on the data that they're running. that's all backwards looking regression work that looks at past stuff versus like looking at what the future is. And obviously the ruling has now happened. And so we're living in the moment. So I think the key message that I want to convey to you and your colleagues is this is not like one of these wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We can find our ways around this type of thing. You know, I will in polite conversation have alums particularly come up to me and say, oh, you're going to figure out how to just make this work, right, Dean Quinlan? Like this is an easy solution for you. And that is not the case at all. This is not a fire drill. This is like this is a significant change in what we are able to consider. And that's why I think we all are, as Amin said, we didn't sign up for easy, but we have to do the work to make sure that we can try to mitigate the impacts of this as much as possible. I would be very surprised if we're all sitting here a year from now with a student body that looks the exact same as it does now.
I would only add to that briefly that one of the things that we know is going to factor into our success is campus culture and how that campus culture takes effect as a result of not the students we admit, but the students we ultimately enroll. And that could be, you know, highly variable depending on who turns up in the pool and who ultimately lands on campus. But we'll see this over time change perhaps the composition and sort of the ethos, the culture of the communities that we're striving to build.
Thank you for those responses. And I appreciate the challenges ahead. I mean, it's hard to predict. I'm gonna ask you to look backwards though a little bit for a second, because you know you all talked about the success you've had at diversifying the student body over the last 15 to 20 years. And I'm not a skeptic about the value of diversity. That's not where this question is coming from, but I want to have a chance to sort of talk about why you were pursuing those goals. What is the institutional interest from your perspective? What was your institutional interest in pursuing that outcome? What is the value or the of a diverse student body, and why is that a goal worth pursuing for you from an institutional perspective?
I guess I'll start. I would say that we know from both data and experience that diversity enriches creative thinking and engagement with critical problems. And you think of a classroom populated perhaps with some economists, engineers, and English majors all tackling the same literature and sort of reflecting on the apple falling from the tree. You know, to an economist, that's diminished return, right? To the English major, it might be a metaphor for life. And to the engineer, it's the laws of physics at work, right? It just adds a different level of dimension and sort of perspective that's invaluable in preparing. So you have not just racial and ethnic diversity, but diversity of background, of opinion, of experience that really sort of improves the learning of all. Now, that is a challenging proposition to quantify in ways that are going to be palatable for audiences that are skeptical of that value. But we've seen it, and that's part and parcel of what a liberal arts education is aimed to sort of provide, is that critical and creative thinking. So we see it and sort of stand by and champion it from that lens and from that perspective.
I think I can't do better about the educational benefits of diversity than Amin just did. So I will just suggest that one of the things that is so important about education at any of our institutions is sort of the way that it can change the trajectory of a student and a family, and sometimes even a community. And President Salovey, Peter Salovey, the president of Yale, and I both took over our jobs 10 years ago, and we sort of looked around and said, this is a country where socioeconomic mobility is stalling out. And we know that our alums, regardless of what income they had, their families had when they started, 25 years after they graduate, are relatively the same income levels, happiness levels, graduate and professional school degree attainment. And it was very important for us as an institution to fuel socioeconomic mobility in a more dramatic way than we were 10 years ago, because of what we saw as just increasing opportunities to do that. And if we can take the students and families who are incredibly talented and incredibly exceptional and acknowledge that, and then bring them to our campus so that they can change the trajectory of the life that they're going to have. That's pretty important for us as a institution and for the state of Connecticut and for the country. And I think the same thing is true for students from underrepresented African-American, Latinx, Native backgrounds in terms of transforming trajectories and leadership and graduate school pipelines.
Yeah, I just don't think that that societal benefit could be overstated, actually. And that's part of it as well, not just the educational benefit, but we know that, of course, the students who graduate from our institutions go on to be in your seats or, lawyers or doctors and so on. And that the best version of ourselves would be the version of our society that has a broad representation of what humanity has to offer in those seats. Helping people to achieve greatness and to have satisfactory and happy lives. The other thing I would add would maybe be to personalize this a little bit. Some of you know this. I'm a farm kid from Nebraska. I graduated in a class of 12 high school students. I went to the big flagship institution in my home state, which will go unnamed, although it's easy to figure out. But, I wouldn't be sitting here today if I didn't also benefit from the educational setting that I was in that had some representation of diversity at that institution. And I could talk more about that offline, but it absolutely 1,000% benefited from the diversity that I experienced in at my home institution that I graduated from.
Nathan, thank you for opening up the door to personalizing this a little bit. At the risk of perhaps too much disclosure, I was going to say that I benefited both from the diversity and the practice of affirmative action. As I mentioned, I'm a native New Yorker. I'm what you call the quintessential New Yorican, born in Hell's Kitchen, raised in Spanish Harlem, found my way to Connecticut, as I said, for education. And so I see this through a very sort of different lens. And when I looked at the Opportunity Insights tool, which is part of the tool that we're going to use to contextualize place of belonging, I looked at my neighborhood where I grew up, 129 zip code in New York City. And the average income for someone who comes from that zip code right now at age 35 is about $43,000. And the ability to look at that through background, through income, and through zip code is very powerful. So I think to speak to the transformative power of some of these opportunities that Richard and others were alluding to, it is personal, it is professional, and it is a societal good. And we saw that in the ruling that the military was exempt essentially from this, and now is under scrutiny as well with the case that's being brought against West Point. It is social good, it is social mobility, it is intellectual investment and creativity, it is the wise and appropriate thing to do. And so just wanted to share that little bit of tidbit of where some of this passion and perspective comes from as well.
Thank you. Let me see if there's any questions from our panel. I have a few, but Representative Cooley?
Yes, and I'm well aware of the flagship school in the state of Nebraska as a proud Buffalo. And I understand the reluctance to admit the name of that institution this football season. Sorry, can't help myself. But want to thank you for coming in for this panel. I know that higher education is going through what some have described as a black swan event, the massive changes. Many students are looking at technical school and vocational education after high school, as opposed to going to the traditional college route. So I just kind of wanted to ask, we're discussing specifically Supreme Court's decision and its impact regarding affirmative action. But I did want to ask, how are your institutions dealing with these overall changes in higher education? We have a shrinking college population. COVID-19 created massive problems in terms of overseas students coming to the United States. A number of your institutions have those students coming in and benefiting, and historically, the United States has done very well getting the best and brightest from across the globe to come here and then stay. How are your institutions dealing with that, in addition to the potential changes that have been created by the Supreme Court's decision. I wanted to give you a chance to kind of put this into a broader context than just what we have before us, because try to be a little bit more holistic. Thank you very much for coming in, and thank you for your answers to my questions. I'll just throw that out before and let you have the floor on that.
Sure, I can chime in first, and I'm just going to resist the urge to go down the path of Colorado, Nebraska conversation. We'll do that offline for sure, though. So yeah, I mean, the landscape is very challenging beyond just the Supreme Court decision, most definitely. The COVID effects, not just on mobility of students coming to the United States are real, but the experience that our young people had, the learning loss, the social loss, and the like. These are challenges that we're facing at our institution. And we're really trying to rise to the occasion there and support our students to reach their goals in terms of their life and their careers. The demographic shift and decline is also something that's very real. And if you're watching our state high school graduating cohort demographic, you'll know that in about 10 years, a little bit more than that, the size of the cohort drops by almost 20%. That's very significant. So we have to think about all of those things, though, every day in our work, and we have to be creative and nimble and really find ways to continue to reach students. We've had success, I think, across all three of our institutions, and my colleagues, I'm sure, will share that sentiment as well. I mean, just for reference, we had 40% of high school seniors in the state of Connecticut this year applied to come to UConn. And of the high school seniors that graduated in the state this year, 10% enrolled at UConn. And those are really the highest levels that we've seen. Those statistics we're hoping to keep them there. And so we don't want to have anything happen that discourages students from pursuing their educational goals. The Supreme Court decision is significant, though. And, you know, the thing that we're looking at in terms of the other states that have gone through this before is that they have experienced declines, and we're not excited about declines in diversity at our institution. We're not excited about declines in the number of high school graduating seniors either. So, but these are all challenges that we have to confront every single day in our work, and we try to do so deliberately in collaboration with you all.
One of the other areas that is a challenge, much like the demographic cliff and some of the public confidence in education, is the rising cost of particularly private education and the skepticism around that. Just late last week, you probably read and heard or saw that the university committed itself to a no loan policy in the interest of trying to support middle income, middle class families who have been increasingly shrinking in representation from our student body. We've done a lot in the access space for less resourced students with things like computers and health insurance and other things, but the middle class had been squeezed to some extent. And, you know, in our space, you know, because we don't have the luxury of having the highest yield, if you will, there's a return, you know, we admit very broadly, but who we enroll doesn't always reflect our values or our commitments. And so this was both symbolic and substantive to be able to provide a no loan policy that ensures that students at least can graduate without debt and can pursue their interests and passions and not do so with the lens of having to repay back. So, you know, there are other challenges. We all have recently presented to our respective boards on the things that keep us up at night, and the list, there's no shortage of things. But in one of the conversations we had was also included in this was the pathway to building pipeline is also now different than it was. The SAT, even though we are a test optional school, is moving digital. And there are data privacy laws that prohibit the sharing of information with some colleges just in that landscape. So you have a demographic cliff, you have a digital cliff perhaps, and other factors that we're sort of going to work our way through. Any of these by itself is solvable, but in concert and in confluence make for a tall order. So it's going to take very, you know, stern dedication and a significant amount of resources, no doubt, to not just increase, but probably maintaining where we are might be not only a moral victory, a substantive victory a year from now.
Yeah, I would just reemphasize what Amin just said. For us, the biggest thing that we can do to counter these macro trends, which my colleagues have done a good job highlighting, is to just invest in financial aid and to try and make this as affordable as possible. Obviously at Yale, we are fortunate to have the resources to spend $240 million in undergraduate financial aid this year, so that 2/3 of our students are receiving some sort of financial assistance. Most are paying, less than $15,000 to come to the university on average. That includes domestic and international students. And I do think that that is the biggest, if I take a step back and think about the macro issue that would keep me up at night, once we get through this moment of a changing legal landscape, it is definitely the cost and how institutions can continue to attract talent at the price point that it takes to educate students in the way that we like to educate them, and making sure that the message around affordability is there, but also the reality around affordability outside of my own specific circumstances is a real issue throughout the state, for lots of other institutions. And so I think that's the big piece of it.
Thank you, Representative Turco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to see you all here today. Thank you for being here. You have made me hopeful, based on what you've said, that through your efforts, hopefully be able to mitigate the impact of this decision between marketing, recruitment, and boosting up the admissions staff's budget, through financial aid, scholarships. There's a lot of things, as long as there's the will, and it sounds like there's definitely the will from all of your institutions to do everything you can to mitigate this decision. I'm wondering, though, on the admissions application decision process itself, if you're looking at amending any of your policies. It was brought up by Richard Sugarman on the legacy admissions, the early admissions, the athletics, some of the admissions processes you have now that maybe are catering towards the more advantaged applicants that don't lead to more diversity. What are you thinking in regards to that aspect in helping to level the playing field? Thank you.
Well, the main thing is actually something that Mona mentioned earlier, and that is, bringing together all of our admitting authorities and making sure that we have brought our admission selection and holistic review into compliance with the Supreme Court decision itself. Secondary to that are some of the things that I mentioned also, Amin mentioned earlier, which is looking at and College Board landscape, environmental factors, and these kind of things, and considering more new information that may help us to identify students that have high potential for success at the university, and otherwise we're not reaching them today. And so those are the things that we're going to do on an ongoing basis. And frankly speaking, there are things that we've been thinking about every year that we're in this work. So our holistic review is really designed around identifying students, finding as many ways as possible to identify students who have a high potential for success at our institution, in particular those that we haven't historically reached. And it's been very, very successful in doing that as a part of our process. The single greatest predictor of success at the University of Connecticut is not any individual factor, it's the sum of all the factors, and that's the result of a holistic application review. But that's not, that in part is by design, let me say it that way, that we have really worked to achieve that with subtle changes year to year. Over time, now we're experiencing a shift in terms of the Supreme Court decision and its impact on our process, and we're implementing that and continuing to try and advance other pieces at the same time.
So we are looking at, as I sort of already highlighted, doubling down a little bit on the socioeconomic diversity question, broadening the way that we characterize our student body in terms of diversity. We want to understand a little bit more about geographic diversity. looking at federal data around rurality, around Title I schools, different ways that we can describe and define the incredible diversity of our student body, and then investing in some of those areas and organizing our selection process around some of those variables, since we will no longer have access to a student's self-identified race. We are hoping to continue to push the envelope in terms of socioeconomic diversity at Yale. We know that our students receiving federal Pell Grants are, as a whole, more diverse in terms of race than many other subpools in our applicant pool. So if we can continue to move that number ever forward, then we know we'll be bringing in students across a wide range of backgrounds and diversity in several dimensions, which is great. What we are not sort of interested in is getting distracted with some of our other priorities. You mentioned legacy admissions, you mentioned athletics. Our athletic department can support a certain number of students in our admissions process. At this point, we're going to try to focus primarily on the diversity questions in other areas. I think the experience we've had at Yale suggests that giving consideration to legacy students is not preventing us from diversifying the student body. I mean, as I highlighted in my remarks earlier, we have completely transformed the socioeconomic profile of Yale's student body while giving this consideration and having varsity sports teams. And I do think that this specific admissions preference for legacy can allow us to differentiate between the incredibly well-prepared, highly qualified subpool of applicants from upper middle class backgrounds with educated parents. And so our ability to use that as a very small consideration in our whole person review process is valuable as we select amongst well-prepared students from these backgrounds. And then I'll also just say that we hear from a lot of our alums of color at Yale who have been very much excited about the opportunity for their son or daughter to receive the extra consideration, because we are now looking at parents who graduated from Yale in the 1990s, and the Yale of the 1990s is a very different place than the Yale of the 1970s, and certainly than the Yale of the 1950s. And so some of the people that we have heard the most frequently from since the Supreme Court decision and since the increased attention to our other admissions priorities is from alumni of color who very, very, very much want us to continue these practices now that it's the time for our diverse alumni group to be able to derive the benefit of this preference. They are feeling particularly sensitive to the idea that that might go away. And that's literally the group I hear the most about this topic from.
I've heard some of those conversations too. Yeah, so our announcement in July about eliminating legacy admission was done at the very much, from an institutional perspective, not as a referendum on what others should do. I think there's importance for institutional autonomy to understand their own values and the implications of that. We recently committed ourselves or reaffirmed our commitment, many to the same initiatives that were referenced already, to Title I schools, to community-based organizations, to college access programs, and also to thinking about success and achievement through a little bit of a different lens. Too often the focus is on the outcome or the result and not the distance traveled or the process. And so there's a need to think about achievement in context and success and potential and not just production. So we're also leveraging our financial aid budget, making some investments in that space. And, we're in about a week from now, we're going to be inviting to our campus nearly 90 students who are a part of QuestBridge, who will rank a number of 50 selective colleges and universities in the country that both Yale and Wesleyan have been involved with for many years. And that is a race neutral sort of program that identifies high achieving lower income students from across the country, many of whom come from rural backgrounds. And so giving them the opportunity to spend the night on campus and to engage and partake in all that has to offer is a significant investment, but an appropriate one, and one that we feel will hopefully, if not serve us alone in terms of getting those students to rank us or attend Wesleyan, but give them access to an experience that might not otherwise be available, and encourage some of those critical conversations with their high schools, with their support programs and things of that nature. So the race neutral element and the sort of focus on context is really a driving factor. That's what we're going to spend a lot of our time in this month preparing for our reading process and selection, so that we don't inadvertently or intentionally perpetuate privilege in a way that's damaging to the individuals. We want students to land on our campuses confident that they bring themselves fully to the experience, that they contribute themselves, not just based through status or association or other things.
Thank you, Representative. I'm going to ask one more question about legacy, specifically, Mr. Gonzalez. With the decision that Wesleyan University made, and there's reports that some schools feel like it's important to keep, and I'm not describing this to any school in particular, but important for them to be able to still consider legacy. We hear about the culture argument, right? That it helps kind of strengthen or continue the culture at school. Perhaps fundraising is a benefit. I assume that Wesleyan cares about both of those things. So yet you made the decision that you did. Can you explain a little bit in more detail why Wesleyan did that and feels like, I assume that it can still maintain its culture and still have robust fundraising?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, President Roth rightly pointed out that, it was a relatively small part of a process. Many alumni children will still find their way into the classes of the communities that they wish to belong to, that their parents attended, or, that are their parents' alma mater. And so to the degree that, or to the extent rather, that students were deriving any benefit, we know that alumni children often have the access to the community by virtue of their parents attending either games or experiences and the ethos and values of that place. In our situation, we didn't feel that it was a very significant thumb on the scale, and that we would continue to see alumni children in the pool, and that we could fundraise on values, and that we would be able to maintain and continue to value multi-generations of Wesleyan students with those relationships. So again, we're only a couple of weeks removed from that announcement and a couple of weeks removed from the application. So we won't see what the impacts are just yet.
Athletic scholarships were mentioned earlier. I represent a community that is the host to a substantial university that has a long history of winning national championships, particularly in basketball. I won't be criticizing that practice. I would just mention though that Khalid El-Amin just recently graduated last year from UConn. Last year, Ray Allen finally earned his degree. So the 25-year graduation rate of superstar basketball players is actually pretty good at UConn, and that's welcome. That's to be welcomed. This might be the last question. If there's someone online who has a question, now's the time to raise their hand. But I'm mindful of the fact that we're talking to a very high level and group of professionals who are dealing with this at a policy level. I have a neighbor who reviews applications for UConn, initial applications, and I started to wonder with. I think your applicant pool was somewhere around 47,000 last year. I know Yale and Wesleyan similarly get thousands of applications. And from that pool, you're trying to cull a class that will represent the university well. And you're trying to identify those students that have high potential, right? How does that translate through that whole process, I guess, is one of the questions I have. It seems to me like there's, especially when you're looking at a whole application, that there's inevitably a good deal of subjectivity in assessing applicants. And when you have an applicant pool as large as 47,000, that subjectivity, I imagine, gets to be somewhat daunting. And so how does the rubber hit the road in this process? How do you both organize and the applicants and train the folks to do the assessment that we're trying to do now in this more difficult environment?
Well, I don't want to speak for your neighbor, but it's 48,500. So I don't want to leave out the 1,500 that perhaps that individual read as a part of the holistic review. It was implied earlier by my colleagues as to some of the things that we do with setting ourselves up for this process of holistically reviewing almost 50,000 applications for admission And first off, they all do get reviewed. And that's one of the common questions I even receive from my friends is, do you actually read all of those applications? And the answer to that is yes. In fact, many of them are reviewed multiple times by our team. And we have a large core, growing core of staff, both seasonal and permanent, who review those applications. We do have a review mechanism that has been built. I suggested earlier over time, and it is really oriented around trying to identify students that have the capacity for success. And we know that in some ways, it's very prescribed. In other ways, it's flexible enough to the degree that we want the process to allow students to emerge in ways that we haven't thought of previously. And so we're deliberate about that as a part of the holistic review, giving our staff some amount of flexibility to identify students who otherwise would not have risen to the top. Otherwise, once we train our staff on that process and how to use the tools that we've provided them, there are calibration exercises that we go through. Everybody reviews blindly, independent of each other, applications, and then there are iterative committees and things that get together to talk about applicants and these kind of things to ensure the consistency and not an undue amount of subjectivity, if you will, as a part of the process. But to the degree that we can achieve all of those things, we really work to do so. Again, allowing for as much consistency and identifying the students who have the capacity for success at the university, and also identifying students or ways that students can come and emerge from the applicant pool that we haven't already identified.
Yeah, I mean, we have a similar application volume. We have about 25 full-time admissions professionals, and then I have about 15 folks who work part-time for us seasonally or less than 40 hours a week reading files. So we have about 40 admissions evaluators. And we organize our process geographically. We actually give each one of those people a geographic portfolio, and it's their job to be the person who responds to and understands that specific context. As we were talking a little bit before, I think in the Hartford Promise presentation, there's a huge difference between the contextual environments that students are going to school in. If they're going to, I live in West Hartford, if you're going to Hall High School, or if you're going to a high school in New Haven or in Hartford or Waterbury, and just understanding those differences is a key part to the process and a key part of that person's job. So let's just say that there's an individual, we'll zoom out of Connecticut, because we have enough applications from Connecticut that we divided up across multiple officers. But let's say someone's responsible for reading all 500 applications from the state of Michigan. They review all of them. They look at academic credentials. They look at the whole person review aspect of it, and they determine that these are the 100 strongest. Those 100 files get read a second time by another individual on that 40-person team. And then they get sent back to the area officer who's responsible for Michigan. And it's that individual's job to present 50 of the strongest applicants to the admissions committee the day that we review the applications from Michigan. And even in the state of Michigan, you're going to see dramatic differences in students who are going to private schools right by the car companies and urban high schools in Detroit, and kids who are applying from the Upper Peninsula. And it's your job in the admissions committee room that day to control for those pieces of context and respond to the most talented individuals coming from all those different contexts. And the committee literally will spend the day. And Amin, when you used to work for Yale, Amin and I used to spend a lot of days together in the room, and you would basically go through the day and you would consider candidates one by one through the state of Michigan and then vote to admit them. And then the next day you wake up and you do Houston, Texas, and you do a completely different context. And we organize the process geographically and try to respond to talent, because the background and the context of our applicants, as we've been going over, is so critical to understanding the non-academic factors, to understanding the extracurricular opportunities, to understanding the quality of the letters of recommendation. We have to control for all that when we do the review. And that's why a student's self-identified race, to bring us back to the point today, can be such an important contextual variable as we're trying to understand a student's lived experience. It's a very person-driven, thoughtful, time-intensive process. And to lose that particular data point in our review, even if students can still reflect on their race, is, I think, going to be a pretty big change in our process.
So at Wesleyan, we receive nearly 15,000 applications a year now. We have 14 full-time readers. We don't have anyone external to the admission office do any review of applications. And after many, many years of lonely nights of reading applications by myself on screen or in a coffee shop, et cetera, we've evolved our process at Wesleyan in part to move to what is called CBE, which is committee-based evaluation. And the motivation behind that decision was to have two readers in real time engage a single application to be able to discuss context, achievement, potential, any variables that might come up in that applicant's portfolio. And that was in part to address the questions of potential bias or blind spots that might be held by a single reader, no matter how experienced they might be over time, any preference or implicit bias that might find manifestation. In real time, those two individuals can discuss the case. It is a good professional development tool for those who aren't as broadly traveled. We're organized also geographically. And so when those applications come to the CBE review, any that emerge as being deserving of additional consideration will be brought to a committee in much the same fashion as Jeremiah described in that discussion, where we might see 100 from a particular city or a particular state and try to identify the strength. But the initial review is by two readers engaging all aspects of that application in real time to have discussions around the various elements of that candidate's background.
Thank you for your response. I wanted to thank the panelists here, the four of you, but also the previous panelists as well. The forum, I think, was very educational for us as policy makers here, and it answered a lot of questions that I had coming in, and so I appreciate it. I expect that there will be some follow-up, maybe on some specific issues, maybe on broad categories. Over the period of the next several months, I think this committee will engage in a process where we're really brainstorming about things that we might be able to do that will help you all do your jobs in sort of maintaining the success rates that you've had so far. It seems pretty clear that that might include support for some of the organizations that do work in the pipeline that you all can work with to sort of identify and unearth and uncover talented students who are out there who through no fault on their own might find themselves just in need of a little bit of inspiration as they overcome hurdles that they are currently facing. I'm mindful, I worked at a small nonprofit that did some work in the college matriculation area for a time being. And one of we call them college advisors, access advisors, came back to our office one day and said that he was talking to a young woman who was the valedictorian of her school, entering her senior year. And he said, well, what colleges are you going to apply for? And she said, oh, I don't think college is for me. And he said, oh, no, college is exactly for people like you. I don't actually think that she ever applied for college, sitting here a year later. And so we need to reach out and sort of make sure that people know it's possible, that their potential, meeting their potential, I think is something that will benefit everybody in the state of Connecticut and certainly themselves, because we know what the statistics say about post-secondary education and the opportunities afforded to folks afterwards. And so, well, I certainly agree that we should open pathways at all different levels. A college education is, will always be a sort of I think a gold standard in terms of having people reach for their potential and to do everything that they can do to help build our economy and help our state and help their own families. And so I wanted to say thank you for your participation today, for the other panels' participation today, and I look forward to working with you in the future to sort of address some of these issues. And I'll turn it over to my co-chair.
Right. Yeah, certainly I echo Representative Haddad's thanks to all of you. I don't know if any of you have any last words of wisdom or final comments that you want to impart on the committee members before we adjourn.
You have 5 minutes to make your final remarks.
Oh, wow. It's like my old TV days. I can stretch for 5 minutes. No, I promise I won't keep you in front. No, just thank you. And we have a lot of work to do in the committee. And I think in the legislature, there's some things that are not new issues. The Roberta Willis Scholarship, right? That's a tool that we have. CONCAP, as was mentioned, our auto enrollment program. So there are things that exist, and I think we'll have to attack this next legislative session, however brief it is, but with a passion for really and a determination, not just in this committee, but to our other colleagues. So we'll, I'm sure, be working with you. I hope to be working with you on those initiatives and others going forward. But thank you again for your time, and we'll continue the work together. Thank you.
Good to see you, man. 5 years, buddy.
You going to forum? Yes.
Good.
Yeah, look forward to seeing. Are you going to forum?
Yeah, I'll be there. You did. I think it was great. It was not, the PowerPoint would have, I don't know how that would have worked.
We talked too long about being that to me like a logical thing. But I would get more students applying if they thought, and even though, and we can talk, I get that you need right, but it's how you do the outside. So for me, it's important that the schools are purpose. And so however we structure it.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk. I know we have a conversation. We didn't get a chance to circle back. We certainly have students on campus now. Yeah, we'll learn more about it.
Okay.
I'll get my card.